Chapter 1. The Arrival. The town of Hollow Creek nestled in a secluded valley, far from bustling cities and the hum of modern life. It was a place frozen in time, where ancient trees loomed over crumbling houses, their branches weaving a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. In the autumn, fog draped itself over the hills like a thick shroud, creeping into every crack and crevice. Few ventured here, and those who did never lingered. Among the empty homes, one stood alone at the edge of the woods, its paint faded and flaking, windows clouded with age. The house had a history, one buried beneath layers of dust and whispers, but for many years it sat undisturbed. Until now, a black SUV rolled down the gravel road, wheels crunching over fallen leaves. As it slowed to a stop in front of the old house, the engine fell silent, leaving only the distant rustling of the trees. Henry Carmichael stepped out first, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a face worn by time, a stoic determination in his eyes. He glanced back at the vehicle, his gaze falling on his wife, Evelyn, as she emerged with a slight shiver. Evelyn wrapped her sweater tighter around her, peering up at the house with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Her dark hair framed her face, but her eyes held a shadow, the weight of the move pressing down on her. Their teenage son, Eric, trudged behind, hands stuffed deep into his jacket pockets. He kicked a pebble across the driveway, watching as it skittered toward the porch. He never liked the idea of leaving the city, abandoning friends and familiar streets for a place that seemed trapped in a different era. His expression remained locked in a frown, his jaw clenched against the chill that seeped into his bones. Behind them, a fourth figure moved slowly, head tilted as if absorbing every sound, every creak of the old wood. Her name was Margaret, Henry's sister, a woman of few words and many secrets. Her face was pale, almost gaunt, with sharp angles softened only by the hazy light filtering through the canopy above. She seemed almost out of place among them, as if she belonged to the house more than they ever could. Together, the four of them stood before the front door, the wood swollen with years of neglect. Henry fumbled with the rusty key, jamming it into the lock with a grunt before the door creaked open, revealing a shadowed hallway beyond. Dust motes swirled in the air as the chill from the interior reached out to meet them. They crossed the threshold one by one, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath their weight. Evelyn's eyes wandered over the faded wallpaper, the tarnished sconces, and the empty frames on the walls. A strange sense of displacement settled over her, a feeling of being caught between the past and the present. She pressed her hand against the banister, trailing her fingers along the smooth, cold wood, and for a moment, a chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. Eric wandered toward the living room, where moth-eaten curtains draped the windows, blocking out what little sunlight remained. A grandfather clock, stopped at some indeterminate hour, loomed in the corner. Its face was obscured by dust, and the pendulum lay still. He glanced at it before turning away, his attention drawn to a darkened fireplace that seemed to swallow the room's meager light. He shuddered but shook it off, attributing his discomfort to the unfamiliar surroundings. Henry carried the last of their bags into the hallway, pausing at the base of the stairs. He took in the narrow, spiraling steps that led to the upper floor, the shadows clustering around the landing. It struck him that the house felt too quiet, as though it had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to disturb it. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the practicalities of their move. Margaret lingered near the doorway, her eyes fixed on a narrow passage that led toward the back of the house. A draft swept through, causing her to shiver, though her expression remained impassive. She walked slowly down the corridor, her footsteps muffled by the layers of dust. The walls seemed to close in on her as she moved, narrowing, squeezing, as if guiding her deeper into the house's heart. At the end of the hallway, she found a door, its surface scarred with scratches. She reached out, hesitating, her fingertips grazing the cool brass knob, but something made her draw back. Evelyn's footsteps approached, and Margaret turned quickly, her expression unreadable. Evelyn paused, catching a glimpse of the door before Margaret's body blocked the view. An uneasy silence stretched between them before Evelyn gestured toward the stairwell, urging them both back to the others. Margaret nodded, though a flicker of something, worry, perhaps, flashed across her face before she turned away. Upstairs, Henry explored the second floor, pushing open doors to dusty bedrooms. Each room held remnants of lives long past. A child's wooden horse with one eye missing, a faded quilt folded over a cracked bed frame, a dresser with a broken mirror. The air was thick, heavy with age, and Henry's breath misted slightly as he stepped into a room at the end of the hall. It was empty, save for an old rocking chair that faced the window. He moved toward it, noting the way it swayed ever so slightly, as if caught by an unseen breeze. Back downstairs, Eric stood by the window, staring out at the encroaching woods. The trees seemed to bend toward the house, their gnarled limbs reaching like fingers trying to claw their way inside. A shape moved among the shadows, quick and elusive, but when Eric blinked, it was gone. He pressed closer to the glass, but saw only his own reflection staring back, pale and uncertain. As the day faded and the shadows grew longer, the family gathered around the dining table, their faces dimly illuminated by the flickering light of a single candle. They ate in silence, each lost in their thoughts, the house settling around them with groans and creaks. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a distant, mournful wail. The candle's flames shuddered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls, making the space seem smaller, tighter. Evelyn stole glances at Margaret, who sat apart from the others, her gaze distant, fixed on a spot just beyond the edge of the table. Henry's focus remained on his food, his fork scraping against the chipped plate, while Eric picked at his meal, barely touching it. Outside, the darkness thickened, swallowing the last traces of twilight until only the candle's fragile glow stood between them and the night. When the meal ended, they drifted off to their rooms, leaving the house to settle back into its uneasy silence. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere, deep within the old structure, a door creaked open, though no one was near to hear it. In the darkness, the house seemed to breathe, a slow, deliberate exhalation, as if waking from a long slumber. In the quiet that followed, the Carmichaels slept, each dreaming of different things, the life they had left behind, the unknown days ahead. But Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the whispers that drifted through the cracks, just beneath the edge of hearing. She knew that this house held secrets, secrets that clung to its walls like mildew, waiting to be uncovered. Outside, the woods watched with ancient, unblinking eyes. Chapter 2: Shadows in the Woods. The dawn came slowly in Hollow Creek, a pale light that barely managed to pierce through the dense canopy of trees. Mist clung to the ground, wrapping the house in a soft, eerie veil that blurred its edges. The Carmichaels awoke one by one, stepping into the chill morning air that lingered like an unwelcome guest. It was Margaret who rose first, slipping out of her room with careful steps, as if not wanting to disturb whatever still lurked in the shadows. She moved through the house, her movements soundless against the old floorboards. Her footsteps took her to the back window that faced the woods, where the trees stood like sentinels, their trunks gnarled and twisted. She pressed her hands against the glass, feeling the cold seep into her skin as she scanned the tree line. There, in the half-light of dawn, she noticed something unusual: bare patches of earth, as though something had been dragged across the ground. Margaret's brow furrowed, but she did not dwell on it. Instead, she pulled on her coat and slipped outside, the fog swallowing her as she made her way into the woods. Back inside, Evelyn stirred, finding herself drawn to the lingering chill in the air. She wandered into the kitchen, starting a fire in the stove. The flames crackled and hissed, filling the room with the scent of burning wood. She glanced toward the window, catching sight of her own reflection, the dark circles under her eyes, the tension that had settled into her shoulders since their arrival. She turned away, pouring herself a cup of coffee, letting its warmth spread through her hands. But even as she focused on the mundane routine, she could not shake the feeling of being watched, as if something beyond the window was studying her with keen interest. Henry was the next to rise, his heavy steps echoing through the hall as he ventured outside to the shed at the back of the property. He had plans to clear out the overgrown garden, hoping to breathe a bit of life into the neglected grounds. As he opened the shed door, a stale smell rushed out, the scent of rotting wood and forgotten tools. He found a rusted shovel, gripping its handle tightly, and began to hack away at the tangled roots and weeds that choked the soil. Each swing sent droplets of morning dew flying through the air, the rhythmic motion helping to distract him from the unease that coiled within him. But as he worked, he couldn't help but notice the silence. It was too complete, the kind of silence that pressed down on the ears, making his own breathing seem unnaturally loud. There were no bird song, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, just the steady thud of the shovel biting into the earth. He paused, leaning on the handle, and scanned the woods. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, as though something moved just out of sight. He wiped the sweat from his brow and turned back to his work, determined to ignore the uneasy prickle at the back of his neck. Eric remained upstairs, sprawled across his bed, trying to distract himself with music playing softly through his headphones. But the house seemed to absorb the sound, dulling it, until he could hear the creaking of the beams and the faint murmur of the wind slipping through the cracks. Frustrated, he threw off the headphones and sat up, staring out his window. His room faced the woods too, and from his vantage point, he could see deep into the forest, where the mist moved like restless spirits between the trunks. He spotted a figure moving through the trees, half hidden by the fog. Margaret, her silhouette gliding silently between the shadows. She paused beside a cluster of old oaks, kneeling down to inspect something on the ground. Eric squinted, trying to make out what she was doing, but her form blended into the gloom, obscured by the shifting mist. He frowned, an uneasy feeling settling in his chest, but eventually turned away, dismissing it as one more strange thing about this place. In the woods, Margaret traced her fingers over the bare patches of earth, noting how the ground seemed to have been disturbed recently. There were no clear tracks, only irregular scuff marks that led deeper into the trees. She followed them, her boots crunching over fallen twigs and leaves, until she came to a small clearing where the earth was turned up in mounds. The scene was almost too perfect, as if it had been laid out for her discovery. She felt a strange compulsion to dig, but she had no tools with her. Reluctantly, she rose, casting a final glance at the disturbed ground before retracing her steps back to the house. Evelyn, still in the kitchen, noticed her sister-in-law's return. Margaret's clothes were damp with mist, her face paler than usual, but Evelyn remained focused on the small tasks of tidying the countertops, as if the monotony could banish the strangeness around them. Margaret offered no explanation for her morning wander, slipping past Evelyn without a word and retreating upstairs to her room. As she ascended, her gaze lingered on the cracks in the walls, the faint outlines of what might have been claw marks near the baseboards. She made a mental note to investigate further. Outside, the morning brightened, and Henry continued his work in the garden. He discovered an old stone well hidden beneath the brambles, its mouth covered by a rotting wooden lid. He hesitated, then reached down, lifting the lid with a grunt. A damp, sour smell wafted up, and as he peered inside, he caught a glimpse of murky water far below, the surface rippling as if something had stirred within it. A shiver ran down his spine, and he dropped the lid back into place, making a mental note to seal it properly later. By late afternoon, the fog began to lift, revealing more of the woods that encircled the property. Henry, Evelyn, and Eric gathered around the kitchen table, their silence punctuated only by the ticking of a small clock on the wall. They ate their lunch in uneasy quiet, while Margaret remained upstairs, her presence a shadow that loomed over the house even when she was out of sight. Eric finished his meal quickly and slipped outside, needing space from the oppressive atmosphere within. He wandered to the edge of the woods, where the underbrush thickened and the light grew dim once more. He crouched near the ground, examining a cluster of mushrooms growing along a fallen log. As he straightened, his eyes caught something glinting among the leaves, an old, rusted locket, half buried in the earth. He picked it up, brushing away the dirt to reveal a faded inscription on the back. The writing was too worn to read, but he slipped the locket into his pocket, planning to clean it later. Behind him, the shadows shifted, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, its shape tall and thin. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat, but the figure was gone, leaving only the rustling leaves in its wake. He glanced back at the house, where he could see his parents moving behind the kitchen window, oblivious to the unease that clung to him like the mist. The sun began to dip below the treetops, casting long shadows that stretched across the yard. Henry gathered his tools, glancing one last time toward the woods before heading inside. As he locked the back door behind him, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of branches clattering together, like brittle bones knocking in the breeze. That evening, the house seemed to shrink around them, the darkness pressing in through the windows. Evelyn lit candles in the living room, but their flames barely held back the shadows that gathered at the edges of the room. She sat with Henry, their hands brushing together as they listened to the groaning of the house settling around them. Eric retreated to his room, lying on his bed with the locket still clutched in his hand, turning it over and over between his fingers. Upstairs, Margaret stood at her window, staring out at the woods where she had wandered that morning. Her mind kept returning to those strange mounds in the clearing, the scuffed earth that seemed to speak of hidden movements. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, her breath misting the surface, and in the reflection, she thought she saw a figure standing behind her, its face obscured by shadows. But when she turned, the room was empty, save for the steady hum of the wind outside. As the night deepened, the house once again fell into an uneasy slumber, but somewhere in the darkness, a floorboard creaked, and the wind carried a soft, almost inaudible sound, like a sigh or a whisper, or perhaps just the echo of the woods outside. And beneath the ground, in the shadowed corners of the woods, something shifted, something ancient that had long been hidden, waiting for the right moment to wake. Chapter 3. The Unearthly Discovery. Morning broke again over Hollow Creek, but the sun barely made an impact, hidden behind a wall of thick clouds that seemed to press down on the town. The air was heavy with moisture, leaving a damp, clinging chill that seeped into the bones. The house at the edge of the woods was swallowed by shadow, the trees arching overhead as if they were trying to reclaim the land around it. Margaret was up first, her mind still circling the unease of the previous day. She slipped on her boots and jacket, clutching a small trowel she had found in the shed, and headed outside while the others were still asleep. She moved with a sense of urgency, retracing her steps toward the clearing she had discovered deep in the woods. Her breath misted in the cold air, swirling around her as she plunged deeper into the trees. The forest was a labyrinth of twisted trunks and hanging vines, the mist winding through the branches like a living thing. But Margaret moved with purpose, her mind focused on the bare patches of earth she had found. She soon reached the clearing, where the soil remained disturbed, as though it had been recently dug up. Kneeling down, she began to dig, the trowel biting into the damp ground, turning up clumps of dark soil. Her hands trembled, but she kept going, driven by a need to know what lay beneath. After a few minutes, her trowel struck something hard. She paused, catching her breath, then dug around the object, clearing away the soil until she could lift it out. Her hands closed around a small, worn box, its lid sealed with rusted clasps. The wood was swollen and splintered with age, the surface etched with faint, swirling patterns that seemed almost organic, like creeping vines. Margaret sat back on her heels, staring at the box with a strange sense of dread curling in her stomach. She traced her fingers over the carvings, feeling the rough texture against her skin. It felt wrong somehow, out of place in this secluded clearing. She placed the box in her coat pocket, glancing around the clearing before turning back toward the house. The wood seemed darker, the trees leaning closer as she made her way out, the fog closing in behind her. When she reached the yard, she glanced up at the house, catching sight of Evelyn watching her from an upstairs window. Evelyn's expression was distant, her face pale against the glass, but Margaret hurried inside without acknowledging her. In the kitchen, Henry was already making coffee, the rich aroma mingling with the lingering chill. He had always believed in keeping busy, and the routine of making breakfast grounded him against the unfamiliarity of their new home. He glanced up as Margaret entered, noticing the dirt on her clothes, but said nothing. He returned to his work, preparing plates of toast and eggs, his hands moving automatically as his mind drifted. As Henry set the table, Evelyn descended the stairs, her steps slow and deliberate. She wrapped her arms around herself, glancing toward the back door where Margaret had come in. Something had changed since their move. Margaret seemed even more distant, as if drawn into some private world that Evelyn couldn't access. She looked out the window toward the woods, but they offered no answers, only the same eerie quiet. Margaret sat at the table, the weight of the box pressing against her side. She kept it hidden beneath her coat, her mind racing as she stared down at her untouched plate. She had planned to open it right away, but a strange reluctance had crept over her, a whispering voice in the back of her mind telling her to wait. She glanced at the door leading to the basement, wondering if it might offer her the privacy she needed. Eric wandered in, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and sat down heavily across from her. He picked at his food, his gaze drifting to the window that faced the woods. His thoughts were still on the rusted locket he had found, now cleaned and resting on his bedside table. Something about the locket bothered him. Its strange weight, the way it seemed warmer to the touch than it should have been, even in the cold. He shivered, pushing the thought away, but a nagging curiosity itched at the back of his mind. As the family ate in silence, the air between them seemed to thicken, weighted with unspoken questions and the slow creep of unease. Evelyn's eyes flicked toward Margaret, noting the way her hands remained hidden in her lap, clenched around something unseen. She almost reached out, almost asked a question that lingered at the edge of her thoughts, but the words never came. Instead, they finished their meal in the same heavy quiet that had come to define their days in the old house. After breakfast, Henry retreated to the garden again, his shovel swinging against the stubborn earth. He worked methodically, pulling up weeds and turning over soil, trying to reclaim the patch of land that had long been lost to the wild. But as he dug, he uncovered more peculiarities. A shard of old pottery buried deep among the roots, and a small, rusted blade, its edge dulled with time. He turned them over in his hands, wondering what they might signify, but ultimately set them aside with a frown. There was something buried in the past here, something he couldn't quite grasp. Meanwhile, Margaret made her way to the basement. She clutched the box tightly, descending the creaking stairs into the darkness below. The air grew colder as she reached the bottom, her breath puffing out in small clouds. She set the box on an old workbench, brushing away the cobwebs that clung to the corners. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the rusty clasps. The shadows seemed to press in around her, pooling in the corners of the basement, and the silence was so complete she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. She forced herself to open the box, prying the clasps apart with effort. The lid creaked open, revealing the contents within. Inside, she found a bundle of brittle, yellowed papers tied with a faded ribbon, and beneath them, a small, carved figurine of some unrecognizable creature, its features distorted, as if they had melted into each other. The figurine was made of a dark, heavy stone, cold against her fingertips, and as she lifted it, she felt an inexplicable heaviness settle over her chest. She unwrapped the papers, revealing sketches and notes written in a looping, illegible script. The sketches showed the same figure, its form twisted and hunched, surrounded by symbols that seemed to pulse and shift before her eyes. Margaret frowned, her pulse quickening as she scanned the notes. The words made little sense to her, but they spoke of rituals and offerings, of binding and release, of ancient things buried deep beneath the earth. A chill ran through her, a sense that she had uncovered something that should have remained hidden. She shoved the papers back into the box, slamming the lid shut. She glanced around the basement, half expecting to see some shadow lurking in the dim corners, but there was nothing. Only the steady drip of water from a leaking pipe and the distant hum of the wind outside. Upstairs, Evelyn paced through the empty rooms, her thoughts restless. She wandered into the living room, pausing before the fireplace where a pile of charred wood and ash lay undisturbed. A peculiar smell lingered in the air, acrid and metallic, though she could find no source. She picked up an old iron poker, stirring the ashes, but they revealed nothing but soot. She placed the poker back with a sigh, but as she turned to leave, she felt a draft against her neck, as if someone had exhaled just behind her. Eric, meanwhile, had returned to his room, where the locket sat on the windowsill, catching the weak light that filtered through the trees. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands, and noticed that the inscription had become slightly clearer, as though time had worn away the layers of grime. He could make out the faint outline of letters, but they were still too faded to read. He felt a strange compulsion to put the locket on, to see if it might reveal something more, but he hesitated, unease prickling at the back of his mind. Downstairs, Margaret climbed back up from the basement, the box now tucked away in her room. She moved through the house like a shadow, avoiding the eyes of her family, her mind churning over the strange contents of the box. She could feel the weight of the discovery pressing down on her, a sense that she had become entangled in something ancient and unknowable. She caught her reflection in a dusty mirror, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move behind her, a flicker of motion in the darkened hall. But when she turned, there was nothing, only the empty corridor stretching back toward the front door. As the day dragged on, the Carmichaels drifted through their tasks, each caught in their own web of thoughts. Outside, the clouds thickened, turning the world into a gray haze. Shadows gathered beneath the trees, creeping closer to the house, as if the forest itself was watching. And somewhere deep below, in the tangled roots and buried history of Hollow Creek, the ground shifted ever so slightly, as if in response to the secrets that had been unearthed. Night fell quickly, swallowing the house in darkness. Candles flickered in the windows, casting wavering patterns across the walls, but the shadows remained thick and unyielding. The family retired to their rooms, each carrying the weight of the day's strange discoveries with them. But sleep did not come easily. They lay awake, listening to the house settle around them, to the creaks and sighs that seemed almost too deliberate. And outside, the woods waited, ancient and silent, hiding their secrets beneath the cold earth. Chapter 4. The Buried Warnings. Another cold dawn crept over Hollow Creek, the sun's light barely cutting through the thick shroud of clouds that blanketed the town. The house sat hunched at the edge of the woods, its windows like dark eyes watching the mist that wound through the trees. Inside, the Carmichaels moved in the hushed rhythm they had grown accustomed to, each slipping into their roles, their tasks, trying to bring a sense of normalcy to the strange days that had settled over them. Evelyn awoke first, drawn by the eerie silence that clung to the house. She pulled on a thick sweater against the morning chill and made her way downstairs, her footsteps barely breaking the quiet. The house was always colder than it should have been, even with the firewood Henry piled in the old stone hearth. As she entered the living room, she noticed a scattering of old photographs on the floor, yellowed with age. They must have fallen from a box or an album tucked away on a dusty shelf. She knelt down, sifting through the images. The photographs were of strangers, families who had lived in this place before, their faces blurred with time. But as she flipped through the stack, she felt a growing sense of unease. One of the photographs caught her eye, an image of 3 people standing near the edge of the same woods that loomed behind their home. The figures were faded, their expressions impossible to read, but behind them, the trees seemed different, darker, more twisted, as if they had shifted over the years. Evelyn frowned, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. She noticed a faint marking on the back, a series of symbols that looked almost like runes. The symbols were uneven, etched in a shaky hand, and they stirred something in her memory, though she couldn't place it. She tucked the photograph into her pocket and continued to clean up, but her thoughts lingered on the image, the strange shapes hidden within the trees. Meanwhile, Henry was outside in the garden, battling the frost that had crept over the soil during the night. His breath came out in ragged puffs as he worked, his shovel turning over the earth. The garden had become his refuge, a place where he could lose himself in the simple task of taming the wild growth that had overtaken the land. But today, as he dug deeper near the edge of the yard, his shovel hit something solid. He paused, frowning, and bent down to brush away the loose dirt. Beneath the soil, he uncovered the edge of a wooden plank, old and warped, buried horizontally in the ground. He dug around it, revealing more of the wood until he realized it was the top of some kind of hidden trapdoor, buried just below the surface. The wood was slick with moisture, its hinges rusted and barely visible beneath the grime. Henry hesitated, glancing back toward the house, where the faint shadow of Evelyn moved behind the windows. The trapdoor seemed older than the house itself, as if it had been there long before the foundations were laid. He felt a chill run through him, a sense that he was on the verge of uncovering something best left hidden. But curiosity won out. He pulled on the edge of the trapdoor, straining against the weight of years and soil. The hinges groaned as they gave way, and the door swung open with a rush of stale air that stung his eyes. Beneath the trapdoor was a narrow shaft, leading down into darkness. A wooden ladder, ancient and worn, descended into the void below. Henry peered down, but the light barely penetrated the gloom. He fetched a flashlight from the shed and shone it down into the hole, revealing earthen walls lined with rough stone, leading to what appeared to be a chamber below. His heartbeat quickened, a thrill of fear and excitement running through him. He couldn't make out the bottom, but the air that rose from the depths was colder than he expected, carrying a faint, metallic tang. As Henry knelt at the edge of the trapdoor, a shadow shifted in the trees behind him. He glanced up, catching the movement out of the corner of his eye, but saw nothing. The woods remained still, the fog drifting between the trunks. He shook off the feeling and focused on the opening, taking a deep breath before lowering himself onto the first rung of the ladder. It creaked beneath his weight, but held steady as he descended into the dark. Inside the house, Evelyn paced back and forth, her mind still on the photographs and the strange runes. She glanced out the window, looking for Henry, but saw only the empty yard, the garden tools abandoned near a patch of overturned earth. A sense of foreboding settled over her. She headed outside, her breath catching in the sharp air as she scanned the yard for any sign of her husband. She found the open trapdoor, the wooden frame dark with moisture, and her heart skipped a beat. She peered down into the hole, catching a glimpse of Henry's flashlight beam as he moved deeper into the underground chamber. A wave of unease washed over her, but she steeled herself, stepping back from the edge. She didn't call out, didn't disturb the silence. Something in the air felt too fragile, as though a single sound might shatter it. Margaret, who had been watching from the shadows of the hallway, emerged onto the porch, drawn by the open trapdoor and the sight of Evelyn standing over it. She joined her mother, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. A part of her wanted to ask what Henry had found, but she kept her thoughts to herself, feeling the weight of the box she had hidden away in her room. The three of them were drifting closer to something, a secret buried deep beneath the surface of their new home. Deep in the chamber below, Henry reached the bottom of the ladder and stepped onto the damp stone floor. His flashlight swept over the space, revealing rough-hewn walls lined with what looked like shelves, carved directly into the rock. On the shelves rested old jars, their contents long dried and shriveled, and more of those strange carvings he had seen upstairs. The symbols twisted in the beam of light, their meanings elusive, but their presence filled him with a deep sense of unease. In the center of the chamber, he found a stone pedestal, rough and worn, with a small indentation at its center. The indentation was circular, the edges smoothed by years of use, as if it had held something once. Henry reached out to touch it, running his fingers over the cold surface, and felt a strange pulse beneath his hand, like a faint heartbeat. He pulled back sharply, his breath catching in his throat. Above, Evelyn and Margaret waited, the air between them thick with unspoken fears. Evelyn's eyes flicked to the woods, where the shadows seemed to shift and move, almost as if they were watching. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself, wishing she could turn back time to before they had found this place. But something had already begun to unravel. A thread pulled loose from the fabric of their lives. Henry climbed back up the ladder, his expression grim, but he said nothing to Evelyn and Margaret as he closed the trapdoor. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the cold seeping into their bones. They turned back toward the house, but as they walked, each felt the weight of the day's discoveries pressing down on them. Evelyn's hand tightened around the photograph in her pocket, while Margaret's mind churned over the strange figurine she had hidden away. The trapdoor remained hidden beneath the earth, but its presence lingered like a splinter in their thoughts. And as night fell once more over Hollow Creek, a faint sound echoed through the woods, a distant, rhythmic drumming, like the heartbeat of the earth itself, growing louder with each passing moment. Inside, the shadows deepened, the darkness pooling in the corners of the rooms, shifting with an unseen breath. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying a sound that might have been voices, too faint to understand. And the house waited, crouched at the edge of the woods, its secrets buried deep, but not for long. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Wind. The next morning, a dense fog blanketed Hollow Creek, rolling in from the woods and draping the landscape in a veil of gray. The air was thick with moisture, seeping into the house, chilling the walls. The Carmichaels woke to the muffled quiet that seemed to wrap the entire town in silence. The sky, hidden behind layers of cloud, gave no promise of sun, leaving everything bathed in a dim, ghostly light. Evelyn moved through the kitchen, her thoughts restless as she stared out the window, her gaze fixed on the edge of the woods. The photograph from the previous day was tucked into a drawer now, but the image of the figures standing against that ominous backdrop lingered in her mind. She found herself watching the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, as if expecting those same figures to emerge from the fog. Her coffee grew cold on the counter, untouched. She wandered through the house, trailing her hand along the walls, feeling the small imperfections in the wood, the tiny scratches and dents that spoke of years of use. She paused in the living room, her eyes settling on a dusty mirror that hung crookedly over the mantel. The glass was cloudy, warped at the edges, and as she wiped away a layer of grime with her sleeve, she caught her reflection. Hollow-eyed, pale, a shadow of herself. Outside, Henry stood at the edge of the yard, staring down at the now-covered trapdoor. He had replaced the soil, patting it down to hide any sign of disturbance, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something lay beneath the earth, waiting. He knelt down, brushing a hand over the freshly turned soil, and shivered as the cold seeped into his skin. The woods loomed behind him, their bare branches like skeletal fingers reaching into the sky. A breeze stirred, carrying a faint sound through the trees, a low murmur that sent a shiver up Henry's spine. He turned, scanning the woods, but saw nothing except the thick fog rolling through the underbrush. He pushed himself to his feet, rubbing his arms against the chill, and forced himself to focus on the garden, on the ordinary tasks that kept his mind from drifting too far into the shadows. Margaret, meanwhile, had retreated to her room, the figurine she had found resting on her desk beneath a shaft of pale light. The figurine was small and delicate, carved from what looked like bone, its surface etched with symbols that matched those in the photographs in the underground chamber. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the strange smoothness of its surface, the way it seemed to hum faintly beneath her fingers like a living thing. She set it down, pushing it to the back of the desk, but her thoughts kept returning to it. She moved to her window, looking out over the yard where Henry worked, his figure small and isolated against the vastness of the woods. Her gaze drifted to the edge of the forest, to the shadows that seemed to dance between the trees, and she imagined she could hear the whispers that drifted on the breeze, too faint to understand. The hours slipped by in uneasy silence, each of them caught in their own thoughts. Inside, the house creaked and settled, the old wood groaning as if in response to the tension that coiled within its walls. The air grew colder as the afternoon stretched on, the fog thickening until the edges of the property blurred into a haze of gray. Evelyn found herself drawn back to the living room, to the mirror that seemed to watch her with an unsettling patience. She stared at her reflection, her breath fogging the glass, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of movement behind her, a shadow passing through the hallway. She spun around, her pulse quickening, but found nothing except the dimly lit corridor, stretching out toward the back of the house. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the feeling, but the unease clung to her like the damp air. She wandered through the house, checking the windows and doors, making sure they were locked, though she couldn't quite say what she was afraid of. As she moved, she became aware of a low, rhythmic sound, barely audible, like the distant rumble of a drumbeat. It seemed to seep through the walls, through the floors, a vibration that settled in her bones. Henry heard it too, a faint thrumming that rose and fell with the wind, mingling with the creak of the trees. He stopped his work, standing still in the garden, his head tilted toward the woods. The sound seemed to come from all around, reverberating through the earth, through the air, and for a moment, he felt as though the very ground beneath him was alive, pulsing with a slow, steady heartbeat. Margaret pressed her ear to the wall of her room, straining to catch the sound. It was like a whisper, rising and falling, just beyond the edge of hearing. She pulled back, a shiver running through her, and moved to the window again, her eyes searching the fog-shrouded landscape. The woods seemed closer than before, as if the trees had crept forward while she wasn't looking, their twisted branches reaching out toward the house. By evening, the fog had thickened into a heavy, oppressive blanket, wrapping around the house until even the garden was obscured. The windows became dark, opaque, reflecting only the dim glow of the lamps inside. Evelyn closed the curtains, trying to shut out the darkness, but the sense of being watched remained, a prickling at the back of her neck that wouldn't go away. Henry gathered more firewood, stacking it by the hearth, though the flames seemed to struggle against the chill that seeped through the walls. He watched the fire flicker, its light casting long shadows across the room, and felt the weight of the earth pressing down from above, from the buried chamber beneath the trapdoor. Upstairs, Margaret lay in her bed, the figurine hidden beneath her pillow, its presence a comfort and a burden. She closed her eyes, but the whispers crept into her mind, threading through her thoughts like strands of dark silk. She imagined the trees moving in the fog, the shadows shifting, and felt a deep, nameless fear settle in her chest. That night, the wind rose, howling through the eaves and rattling the windows. The house groaned under the onslaught, the walls creaking as if resisting an unseen pressure. Evelyn lay awake, listening to the storm, feeling the vibrations in the floorboards. Henry tossed and turned beside her, his mind haunted by images of dark roots curling through the earth, reaching down toward the hidden chamber. In her room, Margaret clutched the figurine tight, her fingers tracing the smooth curves and the carved symbols. She felt as if the wind was calling her name, beckoning her toward the woods, toward the secrets buried beneath the soil. And outside, in the darkness, the fog pressed closer, thick and impenetrable, hiding shapes that moved too slowly to be the wind. The woods shifted and whispered, the shadows deepening as the night wore on, and a sense of anticipation hung in the air, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to be unearthed. The Carmichaels slept fitfully, their dreams tangled with the sound of drums and whispers. And outside, the woods held their secrets close, waiting for the moment when the veil between past and present, between the living and the dead, would thin, and the buried truths would claw their way to the surface. Chapter 6. Footprints in the Fog. The morning came slowly, with the first pale light barely piercing the thick fog that clung to the woods around Hollow Creek. The fog was different this time, denser, almost solid, as if the air itself had grown heavy with moisture and shadows. The Carmichaels awoke to a world that felt muted and strange, their home surrounded by a white sea that seemed to stretch endlessly beyond the windows. It was as though the house floated in an isolated bubble, cut off from the rest of the town. Evelyn moved through the house with an unease that had become all too familiar. She rubbed her arms, trying to shake the chill that seemed to seep into her bones, and made her way to the kitchen, hoping the routine of breakfast would steady her nerves. But when she looked out the window, she froze. There, just beyond the edge of the yard, barely visible through the shifting fog, she saw something that made her heart race. A line of footprints pressed into the wet earth, leading from the woods toward their house. She stared at the prints, the way they cut a clear path through the underbrush and disappeared beneath the fog. The prints were large, too large to belong to any of them, and the stride was uneven, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them was limping. Her breath quickened, forming small clouds on the window pane. She backed away slowly, her mind racing, but she couldn't stop herself from returning to the window, her eyes tracing the path of those footprints over and over. Outside, Henry was already at work, clearing away fallen branches and debris from the stormy night. He moved through the fog with the determination of a man trying to keep his mind busy, but the unease clung to him like a shadow. When he spotted the footprints, his heart jolted in his chest. He crouched down, running his fingers through the mud beside the indentations, feeling the cold seep into his skin. The prints were fresh, the edges sharp, suggesting that whatever had made them had passed through just before dawn. He followed the trail, his boots squelching in the mud, but it wasn't long before the fog swallowed the tracks entirely, erasing them into the gray. He glanced back at the house, its outline barely visible through the mist, and for a moment he felt utterly alone, as though he stood on the edge of the world. The woods loomed around him, silent and watchful, their branches dripping with moisture. Margaret woke to the sound of her father's footsteps on the porch and hurried to the window, her curiosity piqued by the strange sense of unease that had settled over the house. She spotted her parents outside, Evelyn standing near the back door, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, while Henry moved through the fog like a ghostly figure. She saw him crouching by the tracks, studying them, and a shiver ran through her. She hurried downstairs, feeling a compulsion to understand what had unsettled them both. As she stepped out onto the porch, the fog curled around her, cold and damp against her skin. She spotted the footprints immediately, their dark shapes stark against the pale earth, and felt a chill run through her. She knelt beside one of the prints, tracing its outline with her fingertip, feeling the slight dip in the soil where the weight had pressed down. As she knelt, she noticed something strange, a small, dark object half buried in the mud beside the footprints. It looked like a piece of fabric, torn and frayed at the edges. She tugged it free, feeling the damp cloth crumble slightly in her grip, as if it had been lying in the elements for a long time. It smelled faintly of earth and decay, a scent that made her stomach turn. She glanced toward her father, but he was already disappearing into the fog, following the path of the prints deeper into the trees. Evelyn watched Margaret with a mix of concern and fear, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. Instead, she reached out, touching Margaret's shoulder gently, urging her back inside where the warmth of the fire might drive away the chill. They retreated into the house, leaving Henry to his search. But the sense of something unseen lurking in the fog lingered in the air between them, a tension that neither could shake. Henry moved deeper into the woods, following the faint impression of the footprints wherever they reappeared. The trees crowded closer together, their branches weaving a dark canopy overhead, blocking out what little light managed to penetrate the mist. He felt as though he was walking through a dream, where each step took him farther from the safety of the world he knew. The air grew colder, the ground softer, and the rhythmic drumming that had haunted his sleep seemed to pulse beneath the surface, growing louder as he ventured on. He paused beside a particularly twisted tree, its roots curling out of the ground like gnarled fingers. Here, the footprints seemed to circle back, pacing around the tree as if whatever had made them had paused in its journey, lingering at this spot. Henry's hand brushed against the bark, feeling the rough grooves that ran through it, and he frowned. There were markings on the tree, symbols similar to those he had found in the underground chamber and on the photographs. They looked like they had been carved into the trunk long ago, now filled with a dark, resinous sap. As he touched the symbols, he felt a jolt, as if a static charge had passed through his fingers. He yanked his hand back, his breath catching in his throat. He stepped away from the tree, glancing around, but the fog pressed in from all sides, muting the world into shades of gray. He turned back toward the house, retracing his steps, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step, as if the woods themselves had eyes hidden among the branches. Back at the house, Evelyn and Margaret hovered by the back door, watching the tree lean for any sign of Henry's return. Evelyn gripped Margaret's hand, her knuckles white, the anxiety she had tried to keep hidden now raw and exposed. She could feel the weight of the photograph in her pocket, the strange symbols etched into its surface, and wondered if it was connected to whatever Henry had found out there among the trees. The wind picked up, tugging at the loose shingles on the roof and rattling the old window panes. The house seemed to shift around them, the walls creaking as if under a strain that went beyond the weather. Evelyn felt a sudden urge to close the curtains, to shut out the sight of the woods, but she couldn't look away from the fog that wrapped around the trees like a shroud. She imagined shapes moving through it, too fluid and deliberate to be natural. When Henry finally reappeared through the fog, his shoulders hunched against the cold, he looked like a man emerging from a nightmare. His clothes were damp, his face pale beneath the stubble that had grown in over the restless nights. He met Evelyn's eyes, and she saw something in his expression that sent a chill through her. A fear he couldn't put into words, a knowledge that lay heavy on his mind. They gathered around the hearth that evening, each lost in their own thoughts as the flames crackled and popped. Henry kept glancing at the windows, at the fog that pressed against the glass, obscuring the world beyond. Evelyn sat with the photograph in her lap, running her thumb over the symbols, wondering what secrets they held. And Margaret clutched the frayed piece of fabric she had found, her mind filled with images of the strange figure who might have left those prints in the mud. The house felt smaller that night, as if the darkness outside had closed in, bringing the shadows closer. The rhythmic drumming from the woods seemed to pulse in time with their hearts, a beat that threaded through the silence, growing louder with each passing hour. The fog lingered at the edges of the property, refusing to lift, a silent guardian that hid whatever secrets waited in the woods. As the night deepened, Evelyn, Henry, and Margaret remained awake, listening to the whispers of the wind, each wondering what they had brought upon themselves by uncovering the hidden truths beneath the earth. The fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows until the house seemed to float within a sea of gray. And in the darkness beyond, hidden by the mist, something moved, pacing slowly, its footsteps soft against the wet leaves, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Chapter 7. The Old Manuscript. The next day dawned with no break in the fog, the sun failing to pierce the gray shroud that clung to Hollow Creek. The morning was cold, the air heavy with the promise of rain. The Carmichaels woke to a chill that seemed to seep through the walls, an uneasy stillness that blanketed the house. As they went about their morning routines, the silence was broken only by the creak of floorboards and the occasional groan of the wind slipping through the cracks. Henry retreated to the small workshop he had built beside the garage. He had spent countless weekends in this space, fixing things around the property or carving small trinkets out of wood. But today, he found himself restless, unable to focus on any task. His thoughts kept drifting back to the symbols carved into the tree and the strange footprints that led to the house. The fog outside pressed against the workshop's small window, blurring the world into a smear of gray. He moved boxes around, searching for an old toolbox, when his hand brushed against something cold and metal beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers. He pushed aside the papers, revealing a rusted lockbox he hadn't seen in years. He remembered it vaguely, an old thing passed down from his own father, long forgotten in the corners of the workshop. It had been so long since he had thought of it that he had nearly forgotten what was inside. The lock was corroded, but with a bit of effort, he managed to pry it open. Inside, he found a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing an old leather-bound manuscript, its cover cracked and worn with age. Henry brushed dust from the cover, revealing a title engraved in faded gold lettering, Journal of Ezekiel Carmichael, 1864. His breath caught. It was a family heirloom, but he had never paid it much attention before, dismissing it as an artifact of his ancestors' lives in Hollow Creek. He carried the journal into the house, his hands trembling slightly, as if he could already feel the weight of what lay inside. He settled at the dining room table, spreading the manuscript open on the polished wood. The pages were brittle, yellowed with time, but the ink had held. He scanned the first few entries, written in Ezekiel's neat, looping script, detailing mundane events, the clearing of trees, the planting of crops, but soon the tone shifted. Ezekiel's words grew darker, more frantic, describing strange occurrences that had begun to plague the old farmhouse. Evelyn entered the room, stopping when she saw Henry hunched over the journal. She moved closer, curiosity drawing her to the leather-bound book. She caught glimpses of the entries over Henry's shoulder, phrases that made her skin prickle, whispers in the dark, unseen watchers among the trees, a sickness in the land. She read the dates in the corners of the pages. October 1864, not far from the time of year they found themselves in now. As she skimmed the entries, one passage in particular stood out, dated October 28, 1864, nearly 160 years ago to the day. The fog has not lifted for weeks. I see shapes moving between the trees, and the drums continue, as though the earth itself beats a warning. I fear the ground is tainted, that we have awakened something that ought to have been left buried. The children hear it too. Margaret says she can feel eyes upon her. I fear we have little time left. Evelyn's hands tightened on the edge of the table as she read, her eyes darting to the windows, to the fog that wrapped their own home in its suffocating grip. The coincidences were too close, too precise, to ignore. She imagined the Carmichaels of the past, huddled in this same house, surrounded by the same creeping fog, listening to the same whispers. Henry continued to flip through the pages, finding notes about symbols, markings that Ezekiel had seen carved into the trees near the house, identical to the ones Henry had found the day before. There were sketches too, crude but recognizable, of figures standing in the shadows of the woods, their faces hidden beneath hooded cloaks. Ezekiel had written of rituals and old superstitions, beliefs that had been brought over from the old world by the earliest settlers of Hollow Creek. Evelyn and Henry exchanged a look, their fear mirrored in each other's faces. The entries suggested that Ezekiel had known more than he ever revealed to the rest of the town, that he had been trying to keep something hidden, something that had festered beneath the ground for generations. Henry felt a pang of guilt for disturbing the trapdoor, for unearthing whatever lay buried there. Upstairs, Margaret wandered through her room, her mind drifting back to the figurine she had hidden beneath her pillow. The object felt heavier today, its presence a constant weight on her thoughts. She paced restlessly, feeling drawn toward the drawer where she had tucked away her strange find. She slid it open and lifted the figurine, tracing the symbols etched along its surface with her fingertips. They were the same as the ones on the photographs, the same as those in Ezekiel's journal. She wondered if they held a meaning, a key to the mystery that had woven itself through their family's history. She placed the figurine on her windowsill, staring out at the fog-covered woods, the landscape blurred and indistinct. For a moment, she thought she saw movement among the trees. Something tall and thin, shifting between the trunks, disappearing into the shadows. She leaned closer to the glass, pressing her hands against the cold pane. But the figure was gone, swallowed by the fog. Downstairs, Henry continued to study the journal, his mind reeling as he pieced together the fragments of history and legend. He found a page that described a hidden chamber beneath the old root cellar, a place where Ezekiel had found something buried in the earth, a vessel of bone, he had written, with markings like those of ancient rites, older than any history of our town. The entry grew frantic, the script jagged and uneven as Ezekiel described how he had buried the vessel again, sealing it beneath layers of soil, hoping to hide it from whatever presence he had sensed lurking in the woods. Evelyn's gaze drifted toward the garden, where the trapdoor remained hidden beneath the soil. She remembered the cold, clammy air that had poured from the underground chamber, the strange carvings that lined the walls. She wondered if Ezekiel had known that the chamber would be found again, if he had left the journal as a warning to those who came after him. As evening fell, the fog outside thickened, swallowing the last of the daylight. The air grew colder, filling the house with a damp chill that settled in their bones. Henry closed the journal, rubbing his tired eyes, but the words lingered in his mind, twisting through his thoughts. He imagined Ezekiel's hands, dirt-stained and shaking, as he had written those final entries, his mind unraveling beneath the weight of secrets too dark to bear. Margaret joined her parents at the dining table, the figurine clutched in her hand. She placed it beside the journal, and they all stared at it in silence, their thoughts heavy with the same fear. Had they unearthed something that should have been left forgotten? Had they called forth the same darkness that had haunted Ezekiel so many years ago? Outside, the fog pressed closer to the house, creeping along the ground like a living thing. The rhythmic drumming began again, a slow, steady beat that throbbed through the earth, through the walls of the house, resonating in their chests. It was as if the ground itself remembered the rituals that Ezekiel had described, the ancient rites that had bound whatever presence lay beneath the earth. The night stretched on, long and restless, each of them feeling the weight of the darkness pressing down on their home. Evelyn kept the journal on her bedside table, its worn pages open to the last entry. Henry sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames as they flickered and danced, trying to chase away the images that swirled in his mind. Margaret lay awake, listening to the whispers that drifted through the fog outside, too quiet to understand, but constant, as if calling to her from beyond the edge of sleep. And outside, hidden in the shifting mist, the woods seemed to breathe, each rustling leaf and creaking branch a reminder that the past was never truly buried. The fog wrapped the house in a suffocating embrace, and the shadows lengthened, creeping closer with every heartbeat, as if waiting for the moment when the secrets of the earth would be laid bare once more. Chapter 8. Secrets Unearthed. A heavy rain began to fall the next morning, hammering against the windows of the Carmichael house, turning the air icy and thick. The downpour drowned out the ever-present whispers, but the tension that had settled inside their home refused to lift. The house groaned under the weight of the weather, each creak and shudder a reminder of the storm outside, as if the walls themselves were protesting the secrets they harbored. Evelyn woke to the sound of water dripping, a steady, rhythmic beat that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the house. She followed the sound, her footsteps muffled on the old floorboards, and found a small leak in the attic. Water trickled down in thin rivulets, forming a pool beneath the beams. She placed a bucket to catch the drops, watching the water swirl and ripple inside, her mind lost in thoughts of the journal and Ezekiel's warnings. Downstairs, Henry prepared himself to return to the old root cellar. He layered himself against the cold, pulling on an old raincoat and heavy boots. He knew he couldn't ignore what the journal had described. There was something beneath their feet, hidden beneath layers of dirt and time, and the questions gnawing at his mind refused to let him rest. Margaret watched him from the doorway, clutching the figurine in her hands. She had spent the morning tracing the carved lines with her fingers, as if the patterns might reveal their meaning. Her eyes followed her father's movements as he gathered tools and a flashlight, her grip tightening around the cold, smooth surface of the artifact. Outside, the rain blurred the landscape into a murky haze, the woods fading into shadows. Henry moved through the downpour, his coat quickly becoming soaked, the hood doing little to shield him from the chill. The ground was muddy and soft beneath his boots, each step sinking deeper into the earth as he approached the hidden trapdoor. He paused for a moment, looking back at the house through the veil of rain. Evelyn's silhouette hovered by the window, her outline faint and blurred. He reached the trapdoor and pried it open once more. The wooden planks creaked as they shifted, revealing the dark mouth of the chamber beneath. The air that rushed out was colder than before, carrying with it the damp scent of earth and decay. Henry shone the flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the shadows to reveal the slick stone walls below, lined with the same ancient symbols that filled Ezekiel's journal. He descended slowly, each step down the ladder echoing in the enclosed space. The rain above drummed against the earth, the sound muffled by layers of soil. As his feet touched the ground, he swung the flashlight in a slow arc, illuminating the rough carvings on the walls, spirals, geometric shapes, and strange, twisting forms that seemed to shift beneath the flickering light. The chamber felt colder than he remembered, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of the rain-soaked earth pressing down. In the center of the chamber lay a patch of disturbed soil. It was the spot where he had found the bones before, but now he noticed something else. A large, flat stone protruded from the ground, its surface worn smooth by time. Kneeling, he brushed away the loose dirt with gloved hands, revealing more of the stone's surface. The edges were carved with the same runes that lined the chamber, their shapes almost too intricate to follow with the eye. The stone seemed to vibrate beneath his touch, a low hum that resonated through his bones. Henry hesitated, then took the small crowbar he had brought and wedged it beneath the stone's edge. He strained against the weight, the muscles in his arms burning as he pried the stone loose. Finally, it shifted, sliding away to reveal a cavity beneath, a narrow pit that descended into darkness. He shone the flashlight into the pit, revealing a small bundle wrapped in what looked like animal hide, the material discolored with age. It lay at the bottom of the cavity like a fossil, preserved in the cold, damp earth. Henry's heart raced as he reached into the pit, his fingers brushing the slick surface of the bundle. He lifted it out, feeling the weight of whatever lay inside pressing against his palms. The hide was stiff and brittle, crumbling slightly at the edges. He carried the bundle up the ladder and back into the rain-soaked world above. The rain pelted against his face, stinging his skin as he moved toward the house. Evelyn met him at the back door, her eyes widening when she saw the bundle he carried. Together, they laid it on the dining room table, water dripping from the folds of the hide and pooling on the polished wood. Margaret hovered nearby, drawn by the tension that seemed to pulse through the room. With careful hands, Henry began to unwrap the layers of hide, revealing an object within. A small vessel made of bone, its surface covered in the same intricate carvings. It was a relic of another time, older than any of them could comprehend. The vessel's lid was sealed with wax, the edges crumbling as Henry ran his fingers over them. He hesitated, his mind flashing to the warnings in Ezekiel's journal, to the words that spoke of a darkness sealed beneath the earth. But curiosity overpowered caution, and he broke the seal with a knife, prying open the lid. Inside lay a handful of dried herbs, their scent faint but bitter, mixed with something else, a dark, powdery substance that clung to the inside of the vessel. At the center, nestled among the herbs, was a small, carved stone, black as night, its surface polished to a glassy sheen. The stone seemed to absorb the light from the room, its surface reflecting nothing back. As Henry lifted the stone, a chill ran through the house. The lights flickered, shadows deepening in the corners of the room, as if something unseen had stirred in the darkness. Evelyn shivered, glancing toward the windows where the fog pressed close against the glass. She could feel a shift in the air, a tension that settled over them like a shadow. Margaret's eyes were fixed on the stone, her expression distant, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. She reached out a hand, hovering over the vessel as if drawn to the darkness it contained. Evelyn placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, pulling her back, and Margaret blinked, the trance broken, her eyes clearing as she looked at her mother. Henry placed the stone back inside the vessel, sealing the lid once more. He could feel the weight of what they had uncovered, the sense that they had disturbed something ancient, something that had been hidden for a reason. He wrapped the hide around the vessel again, tucking it away, but the unease lingered, a cold presence that seemed to seep into the very walls of their home. The rain continued to fall, the sound mingling with the faint rhythm of the drumming that rose from the woods, as if the earth itself was trying to remind them of the boundaries they had crossed. Henry and Evelyn exchanged a glance, their expressions shadowed with fear, but they did not know what to do with the knowledge they had unearthed, nor how to protect themselves from whatever lay beyond the fog. They decided to bury the vessel again, to return it to the earth in hopes that it would quiet the growing unease. As night fell, they wrapped themselves in raincoats and headed back out into the storm, carrying the vessel between them like a burden too heavy for any one person to bear. Margaret watched from the window, her breath fogging the glass as she traced the path of their lanterns through the darkness. They reached the trapdoor and descended into the chamber one last time, the shadows deeper than before, pressing in on all sides. Henry placed the vessel back into the pit, covering it with the stone slab, sealing it away beneath the earth. He pressed his hands against the cold surface, hoping that this would be enough, that they could return to their lives without the shadow that had settled over their home. But as they climbed back out of the chamber, the drumming grew louder, reverberating through the rain-soaked night. Evelyn glanced back at the trapdoor, feeling the weight of something unseen watching from below. She tightened her grip on Henry's arm, urging him toward the house, toward the warmth of the hearth and the comfort of light. Yet even as they stepped back into the house, closing the door against the rain and the dark, the sense of foreboding remained. The whispers returned, slipping through the walls and floors, too quiet to hear, but impossible to ignore. And in the darkness of her room, Margaret lay awake, listening to the drumming that echoed through her mind, the rhythm matching the beat of her own heart. Chapter 9. The Haunting. As dawn broke over the Carmichael house, the rain finally began to recede, leaving a thick mist that hung in the air like a shroud. The world outside was transformed, every blade of grass and leaf coated with glistening droplets, the sunlight filtering through the fog to create an ethereal glow. But within the house, the atmosphere felt anything but peaceful. An unsettling silence enveloped the rooms, heavier than before, pressing down on the three occupants like an invisible weight. Evelyn moved through the house, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what they had uncovered. Each step echoed in the quiet, a reminder of the secrets they had chosen to bury, yet she felt the pull of the vessel still, its presence lurking just beneath the surface of her thoughts. She stepped into the kitchen, hoping to find comfort in the familiar, yet the warmth of the sunlight felt distant, as if it were merely an illusion. Henry sat at the kitchen table, staring at the remnants of breakfast. He absent-mindedly pushed the cold eggs around on his plate, lost in thought. The journal lay open beside him, its pages fluttering slightly with the breeze that slipped through the open window. The words seemed to pulse with energy, each line a reminder of the darkness they had awakened. Margaret, too, felt the shadows creeping in, a sense of dread clinging to her as she moved through the house. She glanced out the window, where the fog curled around the trees like ghostly fingers. The woods looked different now, less inviting and more foreboding, as if they were hiding something just beyond the veil of mist. As the day wore on, an eerie stillness settled over the house. The quiet was unsettling, the usual sounds of life muffled as if the world had been swallowed by an unseen force. Even the wind had stilled, leaving a suffocating silence that seemed to draw the breath from their lungs. Evelyn suggested a walk to clear their minds, but Henry hesitated, the memory of the journal weighing heavily on his conscience. He felt a strange sense of urgency, an instinct that told him they should not venture into the woods. But as the day stretched on, the oppressive silence became unbearable, and they found themselves drawn outside, the fog beckoning them with an almost hypnotic pull. They stepped out into the mist, the air thick and damp against their skin. The ground squelched beneath their feet, a soft, yielding earth that seemed to shift with each step. As they moved deeper into the woods, the trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting and curling like gnarled fingers. The path was faint, nearly obscured by fallen leaves and underbrush, but they pressed on, compelled by an unseen force. Margaret wandered slightly ahead, her curiosity guiding her through the labyrinth of trees. The mist swirled around her like a living entity, wrapping her in a cold embrace. She turned to glance back at her parents, who walked closely together, their expressions tight with anxiety. She felt a twinge of fear, a primal instinct that whispered to her that they should turn back, but the allure of the forest was too strong. As they ventured deeper, the atmosphere shifted. The air became heavier, charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on the back of Evelyn's neck stand on end. She could sense it, an almost palpable tension hanging in the air, and an involuntary shiver raced down her spine. The trees began to close in around them, their trunks thick and imposing, casting deep shadows that seemed to pulse with life. Henry pulled out the journal, flipping through the pages as they walked. He searched for the passages that had haunted him since their discovery of the vessel, desperate to understand what they had unleashed. He read of curses and forgotten rituals, of the dark forces that lurked beneath the earth, waiting to be awakened. A sense of dread clutched at his heart as he realized that every word seemed to foretell of something terrible. In the distance, a faint sound pierced the silence, a whispering that echoed through the trees. It was indistinct, a low murmur that felt like a voice just out of reach. Margaret stopped, turning her head to listen, her eyes widening in fear as she felt a cold breath sweep past her. She looked back at her parents, their faces drawn, reflecting the same sense of unease. They pressed on, the whispering growing louder, wrapping around them like a fog. It seemed to beckon them deeper into the woods, pulling at the corners of their minds. Shadows danced between the trees, shifting and flickering in the periphery of their vision. Evelyn glanced around, her heart pounding as the realization struck her that they were not alone. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted again. The forest grew darker, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the thick canopy overhead. An unnatural chill swept through the air, freezing them in place. The whispering intensified, coalescing into something more coherent, an urgent call that resonated in their bones. Then came the first sighting. At the edge of their vision, something moved, a flicker of shadow darting between the trees. Henry's heart raced, and he gripped the journal tightly, his knuckles turning white. He felt the urge to flee, to escape the suffocating grasp of the forest, but something kept him rooted in place. Margaret turned, eyes wide with fear, and pointed toward the shadow that danced just beyond the reach of their sight. It moved like a wisp of smoke, fluid and dark, slipping between the trees before disappearing entirely. The whispering grew louder, echoing in their minds, a cacophony of voices that spoke of lost souls and forgotten promises. Evelyn felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a sensation that something was terribly wrong. She instinctively grabbed her daughter's hand, pulling her close as they stood together, a united front against the encroaching darkness. Henry's gaze darted around, searching for any sign of a threat, yet the forest remained still, its secrets hidden within the shadows. They began to backtrack, their instincts urging them to retreat. The path seemed to shift beneath their feet, becoming indistinct and treacherous. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, rising to a fever pitch as they stumbled back toward the entrance of the woods. The shadows around them twisted and turned, coiling like snakes, as if the forest itself were alive, angry at their intrusion. Evelyn turned back, glancing over her shoulder at the darkness they were leaving behind. The trees loomed ominously, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a face in the bark, a twisted, anguished expression that sent a jolt of terror through her. She quickened her pace, urging her family forward. As they reached the edge of the woods, the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating their path and dispelling the lingering shadows. But the air remained thick with tension, a palpable reminder of the darkness they had encountered. They stepped into the clearing, feeling the weight of the trees lift as they emerged back into the light. Henry turned to the forest, his heart racing. He could still hear the whispering in his mind, the echoes of lost souls pleading for release. He knew they had barely scratched the surface of the mystery that lay hidden within the woods, and the vessel they had unearthed was but a gateway to something far more sinister. Margaret shivered, the warmth of the sun doing little to ease the chill that settled over her. She looked back at the trees, the shadows retreating into the depths of the forest. But even as they stepped away, she felt the weight of their presence linger, a reminder that the secrets of the woods were not so easily forgotten. Evelyn drew her daughter close, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. They stood together, united against the fear that threatened to engulf them, but the tension remained, a haunting whisper that echoed in their minds. As they turned to head back to the safety of the house, each of them felt the cold grip of dread settle deeper into their bones, knowing that the haunting was only just beginning. Chapter 10: The Gathering Storm. The days that followed their foray into the woods were marked by an uneasy calm, a deceptive stillness that settled over the Carmichael house. The morning sun rose with a radiant glow, casting bright beams into every corner, yet the warmth felt superficial, as if the sun itself was unaware of the shadows lurking in the depths of the forest. Evelyn, Henry, and Margaret each carried the weight of their experience, a silent bond forged in the heat of fear, and their individual struggles began to manifest in subtle ways. Evelyn found herself restless, her mind swirling with fragments of the journal's dark revelations. Sleep evaded her, and she often paced the house late at night, her thoughts racing with the implications of their discovery. The vessel had unearthed something more than they had anticipated, a deep-seated fear that gnawed at her insides, an instinctive knowledge that they had merely grazed the surface of a profound darkness. The once familiar sounds of the house, creaks of the old floorboards, the rustling of leaves outside, now felt foreign, charged with a lingering tension. Henry, too, felt the unease settle over him like a thick fog. He spent hours buried in the journal, retracing every word and every warning inscribed within its pages. Yet, no matter how deeply he searched, answers eluded him. The more he read, the more questions emerged, a spiral of uncertainty that threatened to swallow him whole. Each night, he woke drenched in sweat, visions of shadows and whispering voices haunting his dreams, a grim reminder that they had not escaped the woods unscathed. Margaret found solace in art, her paints and canvases becoming an outlet for the emotions swirling within her. She immersed herself in colors and strokes, seeking to capture the essence of the shadows that danced just beyond her reach. Yet the images that emerged were dark and twisted, nightmares translated into vibrant hues that both mesmerized and disturbed her. Each piece reflected the turmoil inside her, a struggle between the innocence of her childhood and the encroaching darkness that threatened to engulf her. As the week unfolded, a storm began to brew outside. Dark clouds rolled in, heavy and oppressive, casting the world in shades of gray. The winds howled through the trees, a mournful sound that echoed the turmoil within the Carmichael house. Each thunderclap reverberated through the walls, a reminder that nature, too, had its own darkness. The family huddled inside, the windows rattling as the storm drew nearer, each gust of wind amplifying the weight of the secrets they carried. On the seventh day, the storm reached its zenith. Rain poured in relentless sheets, drumming against the roof, drowning out all other sounds. It was a day unlike any other, the air thick with anticipation as the storm lashed out, a violent reminder of the chaos that lay just beneath the surface. The house felt like a fortress, a shelter from the chaos outside, but the feeling of safety was fleeting, and an unshakable tension lingered within its walls. Evelyn moved from room to room, unable to settle, each creak of the house sending a shiver down her spine. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a banshee, and she felt a creeping sense of dread that something was coming. She glanced at the windows, the rain blurring her view of the outside world, and the thought struck her that they were cut off from the rest of existence, isolated within their own little bubble of fear. Meanwhile, Henry's obsession with the journal reached a fever pitch. He felt a desperate urgency to unravel its mysteries, convinced that understanding the dark history contained within its pages was the only way to protect his family. He spread the journal across the dining table, its pages worn and frayed, filled with inked warnings that seemed to pulse with life. The storm outside mirrored the chaos in his mind, each thunderclap resonating like a warning bell. Margaret sat nearby, her art supplies scattered around her, yet she found it difficult to focus on her creations. The storm outside was both exhilarating and frightening, a powerful force that seemed to resonate with the turmoil within. As she stared at her blank canvas, the images from her nightmares flooded her mind, visions of shadows lurking at the edges of the world, whispering secrets that chilled her to the bone. As night fell, the storm continued its wrath, lashing the house with rain and wind, a cacophony of sound that reverberated through every room. Evelyn gathered her family in the living room, the fireplace crackling with warmth, but the atmosphere felt electric, charged with a tension that was palpable. Each of them sensed it, the impending storm, not just outside but within themselves. Henry leaned forward, staring intently at the journal, his brows furrowed in concentration. The words swam before his eyes, but one phrase stood out, a singular line that seemed to call to him. In the gathering storm, the true power of the vessel awakens. The realization struck him like a lightning bolt. They had awakened something that lay dormant, something that was now stirring, waiting for the right moment to strike. Evelyn felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. The storm was more than a mere weather phenomenon. It felt like a harbinger of something terrible about to unfold. She glanced at Margaret, whose face was pale, eyes wide with unspoken fears. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and swirl, forming shapes that made her heart race. The sound of the wind intensified, a howling that felt almost alive, and with each gust, the walls of the house shuddered as if bracing for impact. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations, and in that moment, Evelyn felt a chill wash over her. It was as if the storm had breached the fragile barrier between their world and whatever lurked beyond. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls, and the air grew heavy with an electric charge. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in, the boundaries between reality and the dark secrets of the forest blurring. Then, without warning, a deafening crash echoed outside, reverberating through the house like a gunshot. Evelyn's heart raced as she jumped to her feet, her instinct screaming at her to check on Margaret. Henry was already moving toward the door, an urgency in his step that matched her own. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but the source of the crash soon became clear. A massive tree had fallen in the yard, its roots ripped from the earth, the sound of its fall a harbinger of chaos. The storm had revealed its fury, and with it, the unsettling truth. Something was coming for them. Henry rushed to the window, peering through the rain-soaked glass at the scene unfolding outside. The fallen tree lay ominously close to the house, a warning of the dangers lurking in the tempest. Shadows flickered in the corners of his vision, teasing him with glimpses of movement, and he felt a primal urge to protect his family. Evelyn joined him, her breath caught in her throat as she took in the devastation. The storm had become a monstrous entity, a force that was no longer just a weather phenomenon, but a living, breathing threat. And as the winds howled, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something dark and ancient lurked just beyond the storm. Margaret remained behind them, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of the chaos surrounding them. She felt an electric charge in the air, a connection to the shadows that seemed to pulse with life, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if the storm was an omen, a sign of the darkness they had unwittingly unleashed. As they stood there, united against the chaos, a profound realization began to dawn on them. The storm was not just a product of nature, but a reflection of the turmoil within their souls, the gathering storm that had been brewing since the moment they unearthed the vessel. It was a warning, a call to confront the darkness that lay within and beyond, and as the wind howled around them, they knew that the true test was yet to come. Chapter 11. The Echoes of the Past. The storm's ferocity gradually waned, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. The rain transformed into a soft drizzle, draping the Carmichael house in a veil of mist. The fallen tree remained a stark reminder of nature's fury, its twisted branches looming like skeletal fingers against the somber sky. The trio gathered near the window, peering out at the aftermath, their hearts still racing from the violent tempest that had rattled their home. Evelyn felt a strange calm wash over her as the winds died down, but the stillness carried a weight that pressed against her chest. The echoes of the storm lingered in the air, filling her with a sense of foreboding. Shadows danced across the yard, flickering in and out of the dim light, reminding her that they were not alone. She turned away from the window, the unease gnawing at her as she recalled the chilling warnings from the journal. Henry was the first to move, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. He stepped away from the window and made his way back to the dining table, where the journal lay open. Each page felt like a doorway to the past, whispering secrets that seemed to resonate with the storm's echoes. He picked up the journal, his fingers trembling slightly, and resumed his obsessive reading, determined to unravel the enigma that now consumed them. Margaret followed her father, curiosity piqued by the gravity in the air. She felt a magnetic pull toward the journal, its presence seemingly infused with the energy of the storm. As she neared, she caught sight of her father's furrowed brow, an expression that hinted at a revelation yet to come. The pages seemed to flicker, shadows pooling in the margins, begging for attention, and Margaret felt an overwhelming urge to understand what they were facing. Evelyn, sensing the tension mounting, stepped closer to the table, her heart racing as she watched Henry trace the faded ink with a trembling finger. The air thickened with an unspoken urgency, the journal's cryptic language intertwining with the remnants of the storm. As Henry turned another page, a chill coursed through Evelyn. The room was heavy with the past, each word echoing the darkness they had unwittingly invited into their lives. Within the journal, Henry discovered a passage that described the ritual associated with the vessel, a dark ceremony meant to contain the entity that had been awakened. The words sent a shiver down his spine as he read about the need for a sacrifice, a binding that required not only physical offerings but the relinquishment of ties to the living. The implications were horrifying, and he fought against the rising tide of dread that threatened to consume him. Margaret's eyes widened as she leaned closer to the journal, her breath hitching as she tried to absorb the information. Images flooded her mind, visions of the shadows in her paintings, the darkness that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface of her art. The entity was not simply a specter. It had a will of its own, an insatiable hunger for life, and they had unwittingly fed it with their curiosity. Evelyn felt her heart race as the words on the page began to blur before her eyes. The vessel, the storm, the fallen tree. They were all intertwined in a web of dark magic that defied comprehension. The past had come crashing into their present, the echoes of long-forgotten horrors resonating in the very air they breathed. She knew they had to act, but how could they confront a darkness that had lain dormant for centuries? As Henry continued to read, the air grew dense with an oppressive weight. The shadows flickered, warping the edges of reality, and Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The darkness pressed in, filling the corners of the room with a sense of malevolence. Every whisper of wind outside felt like a reminder of their predicament, a sign that the storm had merely been a precursor to something far more sinister. The journal spoke of a way to banish the entity, a method steeped in ancient rites that required not only courage but a deep understanding of the past. It described symbols, chants, and the need for an unbreakable bond between the participants. Henry's voice echoed in his mind as he processed the weight of the task before them, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility settled over him. They had stirred the entity, and now it was up to them to quell its wrath. Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of connection to the shadows that had haunted her. They were more than just figments of her imagination. They were a part of her, woven into her very being. She looked at her father, her heart heavy with the knowledge that they must confront this darkness together. It was not just a fight for survival, but a battle to reclaim their lives from the clutches of an ancient evil. Evelyn stepped closer to Henry, her resolve hardening. She reached for his arm, the touch a silent affirmation of their shared determination. They would face whatever lay ahead, but first, they needed to understand the echoes of the past that had brought them to this point. As Henry continued to pore over the journal, he stumbled upon a passage that described the gathering of souls, an ancient rite meant to call upon the spirits of those who had been lost to the darkness. The entry spoke of a connection, a circle formed by those willing to confront their fears, to face the shadows that threatened to consume them. It was a haunting reminder that they were not alone. The spirits of the past lingered, watching, waiting for someone to heed their call. Suddenly, the house creaked ominously, and the atmosphere shifted, the tension thickening as if the very walls were alive. The shadows flickered in the corners of the room, drawing Margaret's attention. She glanced toward the hallway, the dim light casting elongated shapes that twisted and curled like smoke. The echoes of the storm still lingered, and with it came a sense of urgency. They had to act before it was too late. Evelyn took a deep breath, steeling herself. She knew that confronting the darkness would mean diving deep into the heart of their fears, and the thought sent a chill down her spine. They were intertwined with the past, and to face it, they would need to confront the memories that had shaped their lives, the loss, the grief, and the pain that lingered like a shadow over them all. As the remnants of the storm began to clear, the sun struggled to break through the thick clouds, casting an eerie light across the room. Henry closed the journal, a sense of finality settling over him. They had a choice to make: continue to live in fear or confront the shadows that loomed over them. Margaret felt the weight of her decision, an understanding that to embrace the light, they would first have to face the darkness. She glanced at her parents, their expressions a mixture of fear and determination, and in that moment, she knew they were ready to confront the echoes of the past. Together, they would forge a path through the darkness, armed with the knowledge of the journal and the bond that held them together. The house stood silent, a sanctuary amidst the chaos outside. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the room, the family exchanged silent glances filled with unspoken understanding. They were bound together, ready to confront the shadows that had haunted their past and reclaim their future from the darkness that threatened to consume them. Chapter 12. a disturbing pattern. The dawn light filtered through the windows of the Carmichael house, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the floor like fingers reaching for the walls. Despite the sunlight, a chill lingered in the air, an unsettling reminder of the storm that had just passed. Evelyn, Henry, and Margaret stood together in the living room, their resolve solidifying in the aftermath of the chaos. Today was the day they would confront the darkness that had haunted their family for generations. Henry placed the journal on the dining table, its pages worn and fragile, each line pulsing with the weight of their legacy. The passage about the ritual lingered in his mind, a beacon guiding them through the shroud of fear. It spoke of an ancient ceremony that required participants to confront their inner demons, a trial by fire that would test their strength and resolve. The thought of facing the entity terrified him, yet he knew it was necessary. Margaret observed the journal, her heart racing with anticipation and dread. The shadows danced in her imagination, morphing into familiar figures from her past. She closed her eyes, focusing on the darkness within her. It was not just the malevolent entity that they faced. It was the specters of their own fears, the memories that lingered like ghosts in the corners of her mind. She inhaled deeply, steeling herself for the ritual ahead. Evelyn stepped closer to the table, tracing her fingers along the surface. She could feel the weight of the air around them, thick with anticipation. The journal described a sacred space that needed to be prepared. A circle marked with symbols meant to contain and protect against the entity's influence. They would need to gather items that held significance to them, tokens of their past, to help anchor their intentions during the ritual. The trio moved about the house, each finding remnants of their shared history that spoke to them. Evelyn sought a small, worn locket that held a picture of her mother, a reminder of love and loss. It had always given her strength, a piece of her heart that remained tethered to the past. She held it tightly, feeling its warmth against her palm. Henry rummaged through his study, finally uncovering a rusted key that had once belonged to his father. It was a symbol of protection, a reminder of the sacrifices made for the family. As he grasped it, he felt a wave of determination wash over him. He was ready to confront the shadows that had taken root in their lives. Margaret ventured into her room, searching through the remnants of her childhood. Her fingers brushed against a collection of paints, a set that had inspired her artistry. Among them was a small brush, its bristles stained with hues of black and gray. She picked it up, understanding its significance in representing her own struggles with darkness and the art that had been both her refuge and her torment. Returning to the living room, the three gathered their items, each placing them carefully in the center of the room. The locket, the key, and the brush formed a triangle, a physical manifestation of their unity. As they stood back, they felt the weight of their choices settling upon them. The air shimmered with energy, anticipation coursing through their veins as they prepared for what lay ahead. Evelyn opened the journal, flipping to the page that detailed the ritual steps. Her heart raced as she read the incantations, each word resonating with the history of their family. The ritual demanded focus, a commitment to confronting their fears and acknowledging the shadows that haunted them. It required them to stand united, to share their intentions, and to willingly expose their vulnerabilities in the face of the entity's wrath. With the preparations complete, they moved to form a circle around their sacred space. Henry took a deep breath, centering himself in the moment. He could feel the lingering weight of the storm outside, a reminder of the tumultuous journey that had brought them to this point. The shadows around them deepened, merging with the fabric of their reality as they began to chant the incantations from the journal. As the words filled the air, the room shimmered, and the shadows thickened, swirling around them like a tempest. Evelyn felt the energy rising, a surge of power that coursed through her veins. With every utterance, they confronted their past, acknowledging the losses and pains that had shaped their lives. Each word peeled back the layers of their fears, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. Margaret closed her eyes, envisioning the shadows that had plagued her artwork. They morphed into figures of her childhood, memories of her mother's laughter and her father's gentle guidance. Yet, lurking beneath were the darker moments, the isolation, the fear of never being understood. She channeled those feelings, allowing them to surface as she continued the chant, integrating them into the fabric of the ritual. The shadows flickered, undulating like living beings, responding to their collective energy. Henry felt a pulse in the air, a tension that seemed to crackle around them. He could sense the entity lurking just beyond their circle, waiting for a moment of weakness to slip through. But they were strong together, bound by the weight of their shared experiences, and they pushed forward. Evelyn focused on the locket, the picture of her mother guiding her thoughts. It was a symbol of love that transcended the darkness, a light that refused to be extinguished. She poured her heart into the chant, willing the shadows to recede, to understand that love and light would always triumph over fear. As they continued the incantations, the shadows around them began to shift. Dark tendrils reached out, flickering at the edges of their circle, testing their resolve. Each pulse of energy felt like a challenge, but they stood firm, drawing strength from their tokens, from the memories they honored. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the room was enveloped in a bone-chilling cold. A figure materialized in the center of their circle, its form shifting and swirling, an embodiment of the entity they had awakened. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, piercing through the veil of shadows. The presence was suffocating, and the air crackled with tension, as if the very walls were bracing for impact. Henry's heart raced as the entity loomed before them. It seemed to pulse with darkness, its form flickering in and out of reality. Yet, in the face of this unimaginable terror, he held his ground, drawing upon the strength of his family. They were bound together in this moment, and he refused to let fear overtake them. Margaret focused on the brush in her hand, envisioning the colors that had once flowed from it. She remembered the joy of creation, the catharsis of expression, and in that moment, she channeled her art into the ritual. The brush became a conduit, allowing her to push back against the darkness. She would not allow it to claim her spirit. She would paint her own future. As the chant reached its crescendo, the entity writhed, its form twisting in response to their collective energy. Shadows clawed at the edges of their circle, desperately seeking a way to penetrate their defenses. But they held strong, their voices rising in unison, pushing back against the darkness with the power of their intentions. The air crackled with electricity, the very fabric of reality bending around them. The journal's pages fluttered as if caught in an unseen wind, the words etched within glowing with a brilliant light. The entity screamed, a sound that resonated through the house, vibrating in their bones. But they did not falter. They pressed on, fueled by the strength of their family bond. Finally, as the final words of the incantation left their lips, the shadows shrieked and writhed violently, threatening to break their circle. In that moment, a brilliant light erupted from the center of their formation, illuminating the room in a blinding radiance. The shadows recoiled, shrinking back in terror as the entity fought against the surge of energy. Evelyn, Henry, and Margaret stood firm, united in their purpose. They had faced their fears, acknowledged their pain, and now they were reclaiming their lives from the darkness that had haunted them. The light enveloped the room, pushing the shadows away, banishing the entity back to the depths from which it had emerged. As the light surged, the entity's form dissipated into tendrils of smoke, swirling away into nothingness. The air shimmered with energy, the oppressive weight lifting as the last remnants of darkness evaporated. The room fell silent, the echoes of the past fading into a gentle hum, replaced by a palpable sense of peace. They stood in awe, the reality of what they had accomplished settling over them like a warm embrace. The journal lay open before them, its pages glowing faintly, a testament to their triumph over the shadows that had haunted their family for so long. In that moment of clarity, they understood that their journey was far from over. The echoes of the past would always linger, but they were no longer shackled by fear. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, bound together by love and resilience. As the sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the room, they knew they were ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, hand in hand, united against the shadows of their past. Chapter 13. The Hidden Journal. The quiet that enveloped the Carmichael house felt surreal, as if the world outside had been hushed in reverence to the trio's victory over the darkness. Evelyn, Henry, and Margaret stood in the dimly lit living room, the remnants of their recent confrontation still swirling in their minds. The air shimmered with residual energy, an echo of the ritual that had banished the shadows. Yet, beneath the surface, a tension lingered, the kind that hinted at unfinished business and unresolved questions. Margaret's eyes fell upon the journal still resting on the dining table. Its pages, once chaotic with the weight of their family's history, now seemed more like a map to the future. As she approached, a sense of familiarity washed over her, a deep-rooted connection that resonated with the very essence of her being. She traced her fingers along the aged paper, feeling the pulse of memories that lived within each ink-stained line. Evelyn stood nearby, her gaze distant, lost in thought. The victory had come at a price, and the shadows they had banished were not the only remnants of their past. There were whispers in her mind, echoes of choices made long ago, and the burden of regret settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She felt the need to reflect, to sift through the tangled emotions that had emerged during the ritual. Henry moved to the window, peering out at the landscape bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun. The garden, once overrun with weeds and decay, appeared rejuvenated, as if the energy from their ritual had breathed new life into it. Vibrant flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their colors more vivid than he remembered. Yet, even amidst the beauty, he felt an unsettling sense of foreboding. The shadows may have receded, but the scars they left behind still needed healing. As the trio settled into the reality of their victory, they each retreated to their own thoughts. Margaret made her way to her art studio, a sanctuary filled with canvases that told the story of her life. The walls were adorned with her creations, each piece echoing a different chapter, a different moment in time. She stood in the center of the room, surrounded by colors and memories, her heart racing with the urge to create. She needed to capture this moment, this profound transformation. She picked up a blank canvas and set it on the easel. The brush trembled slightly in her hand as she began to paint. The strokes flowed freely, a whirlwind of emotions translating into colors that danced across the surface. Each sweep of the brush released fragments of her past, the joy, the sorrow, the shadows that had haunted her. She poured herself into the canvas, losing herself in the rhythm of creation. In her mind, she envisioned the shadows, the entity that had haunted their family for generations. They had been a part of her, woven into the fabric of her existence, and as she painted, she transformed them into vibrant colors. The darkness became a swirling mass of blues and blacks, twisted shapes that morphed into something beautiful yet haunting. Outside, Henry paced the length of the garden, his mind racing. He felt an overwhelming need to understand what had truly transpired during the ritual. What had they released? What had they truly faced? The entity may have been banished, but its echoes lingered in the corners of his consciousness. He knelt down to touch the soil, feeling the life pulsing beneath his fingertips. The earth seemed to resonate with a hidden energy, a pulse that mirrored his own heartbeat. As he worked the soil, a familiar presence crept into his thoughts. His father, whose memory was etched in every part of this land. The key he had retrieved for the ritual weighed heavily in his pocket, a symbol of the legacy he had inherited. Henry felt an insatiable urge to connect with his father, to seek his wisdom and guidance in this moment of uncertainty. He rose and walked toward the old shed at the edge of the property, a structure filled with relics of his childhood. The door creaked open, revealing shelves lined with tools, weathered wood, and memories. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the wood, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Among the clutter, he spotted his father's old toolbox, the one that had been a constant presence in his life. As he rummaged through the contents, he uncovered a small, rusted lockbox. It was locked tight, and he felt an overwhelming urge to open it. He fished out the key from his pocket, feeling the cold metal against his palm. The key fit perfectly into the lock, and with a gentle turn, the box clicked open. Inside, he found an assortment of letters and photographs, each piece revealing fragments of his father's life, moments of joy, pain, and resilience. Among them was a letter addressed to him, written in his father's familiar scrawl. As he read the words, tears welled in his eyes. The letter spoke of love, of the importance of facing one's fears, and the strength that comes from family. Henry's heart swelled with gratitude and sadness as he realized that his father had always known the shadows would come, that the family would need to confront them together. It was a call to action, a reminder that they were stronger as a unit. With renewed determination, he clutched the letter close to his chest and stepped back into the light of the garden. Meanwhile, Evelyn wandered through the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She found herself in the hallway adorned with family portraits, a visual history that spanned generations. Each face seemed to watch her, reminding her of the weight of their legacy. As she traced her fingers along the frames, she felt a surge of emotion. She paused at a particular photograph of her grandmother, a woman whose strength had been a guiding force in her life. The image radiated warmth, yet Evelyn could sense the struggles hidden beneath the surface. Her grandmother had faced her own darkness, had battled demons that had threatened to tear her family apart. In that moment, Evelyn understood the importance of acknowledging their past, of embracing the shadows to heal. Inspired, she made her way to the attic, a space filled with forgotten treasures. Dust motes danced in the beams of light that filtered through the small window. She rummaged through boxes, searching for something meaningful, a tangible connection to her grandmother. Among the clutter, she discovered an old quilt, its colors faded but rich with stories. Each patch represented a memory, a moment in time that had shaped their family. As she draped the quilt over her shoulders, she felt a sense of comfort wash over her. It was a reminder of resilience, of the warmth that love brings even in the darkest of times. The quilt would be a symbol of their unity, a way to honor their ancestors while forging their own path forward. Back in the art studio, Margaret stepped back from the canvas, breathless at what she had created. The swirling colors told a story of transformation, of light overcoming darkness. She felt a deep sense of catharsis, as if she had released years of pent-up emotions onto the canvas. Each brushstroke was a declaration of her strength, a testament to her journey. As she admired her work, a sudden flash of movement caught her eye. In the corner of the studio, a shadow flickered, brief, almost imperceptible. She froze, her heart racing, uncertainty creeping into her mind. Had the entity truly been banished, or had it left behind an echo, a remnant of its existence? Steeling herself, she focused on the painting, forcing the fear to recede. The darkness no longer held power over her. She had faced it, acknowledged its presence, and transformed it into something beautiful. In that moment of clarity, She knew she could not let fear dictate her life any longer. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, the trio reconvened in the living room. Each bore the marks of their reflections. Margaret with her paint-splattered hands, Henry clutching the letter from his father, and Evelyn enveloped in the quilt. They stood together, feeling the weight of their individual journeys, yet united in their purpose. The energy in the room pulsed with unspoken understanding. They had confronted their shadows, acknowledged the pain of their pasts, and emerged stronger. The air shimmered with possibility, a sense of hope rising like the sun breaking through the clouds after a storm. They gathered around the dining table, their tokens of strength spread out before them. A locket, a key, a brush, and a quilt. Each item was a testament to their journey, a symbol of their triumph over the darkness that had once threatened to consume them. Evelyn, with a newfound sense of purpose, placed the quilt in the center of the table, unfolding its beauty before them. It became a sacred space, a representation of their unity as a family. They were bound together by love, resilience, and the shared history that had shaped them. As night descended, the echoes of the past began to fade, replaced by the promise of a new dawn. The shadows, once heavy and oppressive, now felt like whispers of wisdom, reminders of their strength. The Carmichael house stood resolute, a sanctuary of light and love, ready to embrace whatever came next. Together, they had woven a new narrative, one where the shadows no longer held power over them. They would face the future hand in hand, fortified by the echoes of their past, embracing the light that lay ahead. Chapter 14. The Haunting Past. The morning light filtered through the curtains of the Carmichael house, casting gentle rays across the dining room table, where remnants of their previous evening's gathering lingered. The quilt lay draped across the back of a chair, a symbol of the unity they had forged. Margaret's artwork stood proudly against the wall, a vibrant testament to their journey through darkness. The atmosphere was one of renewal, but a silent tension hung in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to surface. Evelyn woke first, drawn from her dreams by the soft light spilling into her room. As she stretched, she felt the weight of the quilt still resting on her shoulders, wrapping her in warmth and comfort. The peace of the previous day felt fragile, like a thin layer of ice poised to crack under the slightest pressure. She rose and made her way to the kitchen, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath her feet. As she began to prepare breakfast, she glanced out the window at the garden. The flowers still danced in the morning breeze, but a peculiar unease gripped her heart. Something felt amiss beneath the surface of this newfound peace. She shook off the feeling, attributing it to the remnants of the shadows they had faced. She poured coffee, the rich aroma filling the air, and allowed herself a moment of calm, breathing in the scent that reminded her of happier mornings. Meanwhile, Henry had awoken with the first rays of dawn, the sunlight warming his face. He had spent the night reflecting on his father's letter, its words echoing in his mind. After dressing, he decided to head outside, drawn to the garden once more. The earth still hummed with life, the flowers vibrant and full of energy, yet a part of him felt disconnected, as if he were an observer rather than a participant in this moment of rebirth. Kneeling, he ran his fingers through the soil, feeling its coolness. As he dug deeper, the texture changed, becoming softer and more yielding. Suddenly, he hit something solid, a faint clinking sound echoing in the stillness of the morning. With curiosity piqued, he began to excavate, his hands brushing away dirt and debris until he uncovered a small, rusted tin box. Henry's heart raced as he wiped the mud from its surface, revealing intricate carvings that hinted at its age. He could sense the weight of history within the box, a relic of their family's past. With steady hands, he pried it open, a creaking sound breaking the silence. Inside lay a collection of letters, brittle and yellowed with time, bound together with frayed string. Each envelope bore the initials of his ancestors, the handwriting elegant yet faded, like whispers of forgotten stories yearning to be told. As he carefully unfolded the first letter, the air grew thick with anticipation. The words, though faint, spoke of love, loss, and resilience. They detailed the struggles faced by his family through generations, their determination to fight against the shadows that had threatened to engulf them. The letters felt like echoes of his father's teachings, resonating with the wisdom of the past. In the kitchen, Evelyn sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a weight that pressed against her chest. She finished preparing breakfast, glancing around the room as if searching for an answer. It was then that she remembered the quilt and its significance. The stories woven within its fabric mirrored their family's journey. Perhaps they needed to explore these stories further, to confront the shadows of their history and understand what truly lay beneath the surface. As the aroma of breakfast wafted through the house, Margaret descended from her studio, her hands still stained with paint from the previous night. She felt invigorated, a burst of creativity still flowing through her veins. However, as she entered the dining room, she sensed the palpable tension in the air. The light that filled the space felt dimmer, as if the shadows were trying to claw their way back. "Evelyn," she thought, feeling the urge to share her insights and discoveries. However, the silence enveloped her, and she held her thoughts close, unsure of how to voice the rising unease. Evelyn caught a glimpse of Margaret's troubled expression, the paint on her hands stark against the pale fabric of her shirt. She motioned toward the table, where plates of breakfast awaited them. The three of them sat together, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily in the air, the silence enveloping them like a fog. As they ate, Henry shared his findings from the garden. The letters, each a thread in the tapestry of their family history, told tales of courage and determination. They represented not just a legacy but a foundation upon which they could build their future. His heart raced with excitement, the knowledge that the shadows could be further understood, unraveled in the light of their shared experiences. Evelyn listened intently, her heart swelling with pride for her family. The stories were rich and complex, woven together by resilience and love. Each letter was a testament to the strength that had carried them through generations. She envisioned how they could compile the stories into a book, a way to honor their ancestors while forging their own path. After breakfast, the three of them gathered in the living room, surrounded by the warmth of the sun. The quilt draped across the couch, the letters spread out on the coffee table. It felt like a sacred space, a gathering of souls reaching across time to connect with one another. Margaret, inspired by the morning's events, suggested they create a ritual, one that would allow them to honor their ancestors while reaffirming their commitment to one another. The shadows might have been banished, but their roots still lay deep within the family history. This ritual would be a celebration of love, a testament to their resilience. Henry agreed, excitement bubbling within him. He envisioned a ceremony that would draw upon the strength of their ancestors, invoking their spirits to guide them as they moved forward. Evelyn, her heart racing with anticipation, nodded in agreement. Together, they would weave a new narrative, one that acknowledged the past while embracing the future. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room, they began to gather items for the ritual. The quilt became a centerpiece, each patch a symbol of their journey, a reminder of the love that bound them together. They placed the letters alongside it, a testament to their shared history. As they prepared, the atmosphere in the room shifted, a strange energy crackling in the air. It felt as though the house itself was coming alive, responding to their intentions. The walls seemed to hum, resonating with the love they were channeling, the shadows dissipating as light flooded the space. In that moment, beneath the surface of their fears and uncertainties, they discovered a profound truth. They were never alone. The shadows of their past had forged them into who they were, and together, they would illuminate the darkness that lingered. They had unearthed the stories that had shaped their family, and as they gathered around the quilt, they felt the power of unity binding them together. With hearts full of hope and determination, they prepared to honor their ancestors and step boldly into the future. The echoes of the past guided them, a reminder that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead together. Chapter 15: The Gathering Storm. As twilight enveloped the Carmichael house, an unsettling stillness settled over the garden. The vibrant blooms that had once danced in the gentle breeze now drooped, their colors dimming under the weight of an impending storm. A heaviness hung in the air, the scent of rain mixing with the earthy aroma of damp soil. It was a stark contrast to the warmth and light that had filled the home just hours before, as if nature itself was responding to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. Inside, Henry, Evelyn, and Margaret busied themselves with the preparations for the ritual. The living room had transformed into a sacred space, the quilt laid out as a focal point, adorned with letters from their ancestors and objects representing their family's history. Candles flickered on the coffee table, casting shadows that danced along the walls, flickering like whispers of the past, urging them forward. The atmosphere felt charged, each moment pulsating with energy, yet beneath that excitement lingered an undercurrent of dread. The storm clouds gathering outside seemed to mirror their internal struggle, threatening to unleash the pent-up emotions they had been holding at bay. They could feel it in their bones. Something was coming, a reckoning they had prepared for but were not entirely ready to confront. Margaret's heart raced as she arranged the candles, their flames flickering in rhythm with her thoughts. She glanced toward the window, where the first drops of rain began to splatter against the glass. The storm had arrived. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, grounding herself in the present. Her fingers brushed the edges of the quilt, tracing the stitches that held their family's stories together. It was a reminder of their resilience, the love that had seen them through even the darkest of times. Outside, the wind howled, sending gusts of cold air through the garden, rattling the branches of the trees like anxious fingers. Shadows lengthened, creeping closer as if drawn by the gravity of their gathering. Henry stood by the window, watching the storm unleash its fury on the landscape. He felt an unsettling mix of anticipation and fear stirring within him. The power of nature seemed to echo the emotional tempest they were about to embark upon, a physical manifestation of the shadows they sought to confront. Evelyn sensed the growing tension, the heaviness of the air pressing against her chest. As she lit the candles, she could feel the energy in the room shifting. It was a potent mix of hope and trepidation, an unspoken understanding that they were about to confront something far more significant than they had anticipated. They had unearthed their family's past, but the depths of those stories might hold darker truths. As the storm raged outside, the trio gathered around the quilt, each taking a moment to center themselves in the space they had created. The letters lay before them, their fragile paper soaked in history, and as they held hands, an unspoken bond connected them. They could feel the presence of their ancestors surrounding them, urging them forward. In that moment, they became a conduit for the stories they had discovered, ready to weave together their past and present. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows as if trying to break through the barriers they had erected. They could feel the house shudder, the walls creaking in protest as the storm bore down on them. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, casting eerie shadows that danced ominously across the walls. Evelyn's heart raced as she looked at Henry and Margaret, their faces lit by the flickering flames, each bearing a mixture of determination and fear. With a deep breath, Henry reached for the first letter. It felt heavy in his hands, a weight of history pressing upon him. He unfolded it slowly, the paper fragile and worn, and began to read silently, his eyes scanning the delicate script. The words spoke of love lost, of sacrifices made, and the burden of carrying the past forward. With each sentence, he could feel the emotions washing over him: grief, longing, hope. The connection to his ancestors deepened, weaving a thread that bound him to them. Evelyn and Margaret watched him, their hearts aligned with the stories being unveiled. They understood that the gathering storm outside mirrored the tumultuous emotions they were beginning to unravel. The air felt electric, charged with the energy of their ancestors, ready to confront the shadows that lingered in the depths of their family history. As Henry continued to read, the storm outside escalated. Thunder rumbled like a warning bell, reverberating through the walls of the house. The candles flickered, casting wild shadows that seemed to come alive, dancing in chaotic rhythm with the storm. The rain lashed against the windows, a relentless pounding that echoed the tension in the room. Suddenly, a deafening clap of thunder struck, shaking the very foundation of the Carmichael house. The lights flickered, plunging them momentarily into darkness. A chill ran down Evelyn's spine, and she instinctively reached for Margaret's hand, feeling the warmth of her sister's grip grounding her in the chaos. As the lights returned, a feeling of dread settled over them. The atmosphere shifted, the energy in the room morphing into something darker. The shadows that had once felt like whispers now loomed large, their presence palpable. The past they sought to understand began to feel like an inescapable weight, the stories of resilience intertwined with darkness that they couldn't yet comprehend. Henry put the letter down, the paper trembling in his hands. He sensed the shadows around them, felt them reaching out as if to envelop him. The room pulsed with the weight of their shared history, each breath a reminder of the burdens they carried. Margaret's eyes darted to the window, the wind howling outside as if echoing their unspoken fears. With renewed determination, Evelyn took a deep breath, centering herself in the energy of the room. They had come together to confront their history, to embrace both the light and the dark. The storm outside raged on, a fierce reminder of the turmoil within. The gathering storm was not just a physical event. It was a reflection of the reckoning they were about to face. In that moment, they resolved to continue, to dive deeper into their family's history. With the storm as their backdrop, they were reminded that even in the darkest moments, there was always a glimmer of hope. Together, they would face the shadows, uncovering the truth that lay beneath the surface. The storm might rage on, but within the Carmichael house, they would find their strength and unity, ready to confront whatever lay ahead. Chapter 16. Terror in the Hallway. The storm raged on throughout the night, its howling winds a relentless chorus that wrapped around the Carmichael house. Inside, the flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows across the walls, creating a surreal landscape that seemed alive with memories. Henry, Evelyn, and Margaret sat huddled together, each grappling with the echoes of the past as they delved deeper into the stories laid out before them. As the rain lashed against the windows, Henry reached for the second letter, feeling a surge of determination coursing through him. He had felt the power of the first letter, its words resonating with their ancestral struggles, urging them to confront the darkness that loomed over their family. He carefully unfolded the fragile parchment, revealing a message that spoke of heartache and resilience. The words flowed like a river, each sentence painting a vivid picture of love lost and battles fought. The letter detailed a moment in his ancestor's life, a time when hope seemed fleeting and despair threatened to consume them. It spoke of a storm much like the one raging outside, a metaphorical tempest that had tested the strength of their family bonds. As Henry read silently, his heart raced with a mixture of sorrow and admiration for those who had come before him. The sacrifices they had made reverberated through time, echoing in the very fabric of his being. He could almost hear the whispers of their voices in the room, guiding him through the darkness. He could feel their presence, as though they stood beside him, urging him to carry their stories forward. Evelyn leaned in closer, her eyes fixed on the letter, as if the words held the power to unlock the secrets of their lineage. The flickering candlelight reflected in her eyes, illuminating the determination that burned within her. Each word was a testament to the strength of their ancestors, the courage they had shown in the face of adversity. Outside, the storm intensified, lightning illuminating the night sky in brilliant flashes. The thunder rumbled like a beast awakened, its growl echoing through the house. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the chill seep into her bones. The tension in the room mirrored the tempest outside, a palpable energy that left her both exhilarated and uneasy. With the letter clutched tightly in his hands, Henry turned his gaze to Margaret, his eyes searching for a sense of connection. They were all part of this story, woven together by the threads of history. The weight of their shared past hung heavily in the air, each echo a reminder of the struggles they faced. He began to share the contents of the letter through his expressions, his furrowed brow, the way his fingers tightened around the paper as he relayed the weight of the emotions contained within. Margaret's eyes widened, absorbing the gravity of the words as she connected with the pain and resilience of their ancestors. She could feel the shadows of the past reaching out, wrapping around them, pulling them deeper into the heart of their family's narrative. As Henry recounted the story, the storm outside reached a crescendo, rain pounding against the roof like a drumbeat, each drop resonating with the pulse of their history. The winds howled, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the very essence of their ancestors was alive in the storm, joining them in their ritual. With every letter Henry revealed, the energy in the room swelled, a collective heartbeat echoing through time. They were no longer just descendants. They were the embodiment of every struggle, every triumph, and every loss experienced by those who had come before them. The shadows of the past loomed large, but in that moment, they felt a flicker of hope, a spark ignited by the strength of their lineage. Margaret reached for the next letter, her fingers trembling with anticipation. The candlelight illuminated her face, casting a glow that mirrored her resolve. The storm outside roared, but within the Carmichael house, they were safe, surrounded by the stories that had shaped their existence. She unfolded the letter, and as she began to read, the words painted vivid scenes of resilience amidst despair. The letter told of a time when love had triumphed over darkness, when the bonds of family had been tested but never broken. It spoke of celebrations amidst the storms of life, of laughter shared in the face of sorrow. Margaret's heart swelled as she absorbed the essence of those moments, the spirit of their ancestors infusing her with strength. As she continued to read, Evelyn's thoughts drifted back to the quilt that lay beneath them, the vibrant colors and patterns representing the stories they had woven together. Each patch told a tale, a fragment of their family history stitched together with love and resilience. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, they could find light in one another. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the Carmichael house felt like a sanctuary. With each letter, they ventured deeper into the labyrinth of their family's past, unearthing both the beauty and the pain. They could feel the presence of their ancestors, guiding them through the storm, reminding them that they were never truly alone. With the last letter in hand, Henry looked around the room, his heart filled with gratitude for the journey they had undertaken together. The echoes of the past reverberated in his soul, a reminder of the strength that lay within their family. They had faced the shadows, and in doing so, had unearthed a legacy of resilience that would carry them through the challenges to come. As the storm began to wane, the wind softened, and the rain eased into a gentle patter against the windows. A hush fell over the room, a calm settling in after the chaos. The energy that had once felt overwhelming transformed into a warm embrace, a sense of peace washing over them. They sat in silence, each reflecting on the letters that had been unveiled, the stories of love, loss, and resilience echoing in their hearts. The darkness that had once loomed over them now felt more like a memory, a reminder of the strength they possessed to rise above it. As the candles flickered gently, casting a soft glow throughout the room, they understood that the journey was far from over. They had uncovered the past, but the future still awaited them, filled with unknowns and possibilities. Together, they would continue to weave their narrative, honoring the echoes of their ancestors while embracing the light that lay ahead. In that moment of quiet reflection, the Carmichael house stood as a testament to their strength, a sanctuary where the shadows of the past had been transformed into a guiding light for their future. The storm may have left its mark, but within these walls, they had found a home, a place where love and resilience would always prevail. Chapter 17. The Final Encounter. As dawn broke over the horizon, the storm clouds began to dissipate, revealing a sky painted in soft hues of orange and pink. The Carmichael house stood resilient against the aftermath of the tempest, its windows glistening with remnants of rain. Inside, the atmosphere felt transformed, as if the very air breathed relief after a night steeped in revelations and memories. Henry, Evelyn, and Margaret sat in a circle, the quilt still spread beneath them, now a comforting presence amidst the emotional remnants of their journey. The letters lay scattered around, each one a portal into the past, each one carrying the weight of their family's history. With the storm behind them, a new wave of determination washed over them, a quiet resolve to confront the shadows that lingered within their own lives. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the room, Margaret felt a stirring in her heart. The stories they had unearthed were not just relics of the past. They were mirrors reflecting their own struggles, fears, and aspirations. She could feel the echoes of her ancestors urging her to acknowledge the shadows that had haunted her. Her gaze drifted to Henry, who sat deep in thought, his brow furrowed as he contemplated the weight of their discoveries. He had uncovered layers of history that resonated deeply within him. The knowledge that his ancestors had faced their own demons ignited a spark of courage in his chest. If they could confront their fears, so could he. Evelyn, sensing the shift in the air, closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the warmth of the sun to wash over her. She had felt the power of their gathering, the connection to their ancestors fueling her resolve. The shadows that had once seemed overwhelming now felt like challenges to be faced, rather than obstacles to be feared. The past had brought them here, but it was their actions in the present that would shape their future. With a deep breath, Margaret rose to her feet, her determination palpable. The shadows within her were no longer ghosts to be feared. They were lessons to be learned. She walked to the window, peering outside at the garden, where droplets of water glistened on the petals of flowers that had weathered the storm. The beauty of the scene brought her a sense of calm, and she felt a stirring in her soul, a desire to confront the fears that had long held her captive. Henry and Evelyn joined her at the window, their eyes scanning the aftermath of the storm. The garden looked renewed, the colors brighter and more vivid than before. It was a testament to the power of resilience, a reminder that even after the fiercest of storms, life could begin again. In that moment, they understood that healing was not a destination but a journey, a continuous process of acknowledging the shadows within themselves. Evelyn turned her gaze inward, reflecting on the stories they had uncovered. The emotions contained within the letters echoed in her heart, urging her to confront the feelings she had long buried. The burden of her past weighed heavily on her shoulders, yet she felt a glimmer of hope. If their ancestors could rise from their struggles, so could she. She resolved to face the shadows that had lingered in her mind, to acknowledge the pain and uncertainty that had defined her journey. Henry, inspired by his sister's strength, took a step forward, feeling a surge of determination swell within him. He had always been the protector, the one who shielded his family from the darkness, but now he realized that true strength lay in vulnerability. To confront the shadows within himself, he would need to embrace his own fears and insecurities. The letters had opened his eyes to the complexity of their family's history, revealing the layers of emotion that shaped their existence. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the three of them made their way to the center of the living room, where the quilt still lay, a vibrant tapestry of their family's journey. They stood in silence, allowing the weight of their experiences to settle in the space between them. The quilt became a symbol of their shared history, a reminder that they were all interconnected, bound by the stories of their ancestors. Margaret knelt beside the quilt, tracing her fingers over the stitches that held their family's legacy together. Each patch represented a moment in time, a story of resilience, love, and loss. The weight of their history pressed against her, but instead of feeling burdened, she felt empowered. It was a reminder that they were not alone in their struggles. They carried the strength of their ancestors within them. Henry joined her, kneeling beside Margaret, his fingers brushing against the fabric. Together, they created a circle, enveloping Evelyn in their embrace. In that moment, they understood that they had the power to change the narrative of their lives. The shadows that had once felt suffocating began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of hope and renewal. As the day unfolded, the three of them embarked on a journey of self-discovery, delving into the shadows that lingered within their hearts. They reflected on their individual struggles, acknowledging the pain that had shaped their lives. In the warmth of the morning sun, they found solace in each other, their shared experiences creating an unbreakable bond. The echoes of their ancestors served as a guiding light, illuminating their path as they ventured into the unknown. They understood that confronting the shadows within themselves would not be easy, but it was a necessary step toward healing. They would carry the lessons of the past with them, weaving their own stories into the fabric of their family's legacy. With newfound determination, they made a pact to face their fears together. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but they would embrace each moment as an opportunity for growth. As they stepped away from the quilt, they felt the weight of their ancestors lifting, replaced by a sense of liberation and empowerment. Outside, the garden glimmered in the sunlight, a testament to resilience and rebirth. The storm had passed, leaving behind a renewed sense of hope. In the embrace of the morning light, the Carmichael family stood united, ready to confront the shadows within themselves and embrace the beauty of their shared journey. Chapter 18. Escape or Surrender. The sun hung high in the sky, casting its golden rays across the Carmichael house, illuminating every corner and filling the air with warmth. The remnants of the storm had vanished, leaving behind a tranquil stillness that enveloped the family like a comforting blanket. In the aftermath of their emotional journey, the Carmichaels felt a profound sense of clarity, a newfound understanding of themselves and the legacy they carried. Henry, Evelyn, and Margaret moved throughout the house, their hearts lighter as they began to embrace the changes within them. The letters they had uncovered, the stories of their ancestors, were no longer mere echoes of the past. They had transformed into guiding principles that illuminated their path forward. Each step they took resonated with purpose as they acknowledged the strength that lay within their shared history. In the living room, the quilt remained a symbol of their journey, the vibrant patches telling a story of resilience and unity. Margaret knelt before it, her fingers gliding over the fabric as she recalled the revelations they had experienced together. The quilt represented not just their family history, but also the journey they had undertaken to confront their shadows. It was a reminder that healing was a collaborative effort, one that required vulnerability and trust. As Henry and Evelyn joined her, they formed a circle around the quilt, standing together in silent reflection. The light filtered through the windows, casting gentle patterns on the floor, and for a moment, they felt as if their ancestors were with them, watching over them with pride. The connection to their past had strengthened their resolve, binding them together in ways they had never imagined. Evelyn took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the fresh air that poured through the open windows. The storm had cleared not only the skies, but also the weight that had settled in her heart. She had confronted the shadows of her past, and in doing so, discovered a reservoir of strength she had never known existed. The sun's warmth embraced her, instilling a sense of hope that fueled her desire to move forward with purpose. Together, they ventured outside into the garden, the vibrant colors of the flowers blooming in response to the sun's nurturing touch. The air was fragrant with the scent of fresh earth and blossoming petals, a reminder that life continued to flourish even after the harshest storms. As they walked through the garden, they could hear the gentle rustle of leaves and the cheerful chirping of birds, a symphony of nature that celebrated their newfound light. Margaret bent down to examine a cluster of flowers, her heart swelling with gratitude for the beauty surrounding her. Each bloom represented a moment of joy, a fragment of their family's legacy interwoven with the resilience they had discovered within themselves. She picked a small blossom and tucked it behind her ear, a token of their journey, a reminder to embrace the light that had emerged from the darkness. Henry wandered further into the garden, his gaze drawn to a patch of sunlight filtering through the branches of an ancient oak tree. It stood tall and steadfast, its roots deeply anchored in the earth. The tree became a metaphor for their own journey, a symbol of strength and stability. They, too, were rooted in the lessons of their ancestors, able to weather the storms that life presented. As they gathered beneath the oak tree, they felt a sense of unity, an unspoken bond that transcended words. The shadows that had once loomed over them had transformed into a backdrop for their growth. Each moment of reflection had paved the way for a brighter future, and now they stood together, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. In the distance, a gentle breeze whispered through the garden, carrying with it the laughter of children playing nearby. The sound filled their hearts with warmth, a reminder of the cycles of life that continued to unfold. They had emerged from their trials with a deeper understanding of themselves and a profound appreciation for the strength that resided within their family. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden, the Carmichael family returned to the house. The evening light created a magical atmosphere, as if time had slowed to allow them to savor this moment of renewal. They gathered in the living room, the quilt draped over the back of the couch, a comforting presence as they settled into their familiar space. In silence, they reflected on their journey, each of them holding the memories of the letters and the stories they had uncovered close to their hearts. They understood that their journey was not merely about confronting the past, but also about embracing the future. The shadows had led them to the light, and now, it was time to step into a new chapter of their lives. The warmth of the evening enveloped them, and they felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the journey they had shared. The memories of their ancestors whispered through the air, guiding them toward new beginnings. They knew that challenges would arise, but with the strength of their family and the lessons of the past to guide them, they could face anything. As the sun set beyond the horizon, painting the sky with brilliant hues of orange and pink, the Carmichael family held hands, a circle of unity. In that moment, they understood the power of their shared history, the threads of their lineage woven together into a tapestry of resilience and hope. They were not merely a family. They were a legacy, a testament to the strength that came from embracing both the light and the shadows. With hearts full of hope and the promise of new beginnings, they stepped into the embrace of the evening, ready to create their own stories, to continue the legacy of resilience and love that had defined the Carmichael name for generations. Together, they would navigate the uncharted waters of life, forever guided by the light that emerged from the shadows within.